Welcome, friend. Find your comfort, settle in, and let your mind drift across the vast expanse of time. Tonight, we journey to the 13th century, to windswept grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon, to a world where horsemen moved like shadows across the steppe, and where one man's vision would reshape the entire known world. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the tropical shores of Southeast Asia. Before we begin this journey together, if you enjoy these historical voyages into the past, a gentle like or subscribe helps others find their way here too. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you rest? Share in the comments below. Now, close your eyes if you wish, breathe deeply, and let us travel back 8 centuries to the endless grasslands of Mongolia, where our story begins. Chapter 1. The Steppe Before the Storm. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of the world. Before you stretches an ocean of grass, endless and undulating, moving like water beneath an infinite sky. This is the Mongolian steppe, a landscape so vast that a rider could travel for weeks and see nothing but rolling grasslands meeting the horizon in every direction. The air here is thin and sharp, scented with wild sage and the distant promise of rain. In summer, the steppe blooms with wildflowers, purples and yellows scattered across a green canvas that seems to breathe with the wind. In winter, this same land becomes a frozen desert, where temperatures plunge far below zero, and survival itself becomes an act of will. This is a land that shapes its people. The Mongols who called this steppe home were not farmers tethered to fields, nor city dwellers bound by walls. They were nomads, people of the wind, moving with the seasons in an ancient rhythm that their ancestors had followed for thousands of years. Their homes were jurs, circular felt tents that could be assembled or dismantled in less than an hour. Portable dwellings, perfectly suited to a life of constant movement. These were not a unified people. Not yet. In the 12th century, the Mongolian plateau was home to dozens of competing tribes, each with its own Khan, its own warriors, its own ambitions. The Merkits controlled the northern forests. The Tatars held the eastern grasslands. The Kerites, who had adopted Christianity from distant Nestorian missionaries, dominated the central regions. The Naimans ruled the west, wealthy and powerful, their Khans educated in the script and culture of the Uyghurs. Between these major tribes existed countless smaller clans, each fiercely independent, each ready to fight for grazing rights, water sources, or simple survival. The steppe knew no peace. Alliances formed and dissolved like morning mist. Blood feuds passed from father to son across generations. Raids were not acts of war. They were simply life. But this violence had its own logic, its own code. Among the Mongols, courage was the highest virtue. A warrior who fought bravely was honored even in death, even by his enemies. Loyalty to one's clan was absolute. Hospitality was sacred. A stranger arriving at a jur could expect food, shelter, and protection, no questions asked. The horse was everything. Mongolian children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. By age 5, they were racing across the steppe. By 10, they could shoot arrows at full gallop, with deadly accuracy. The Mongolian horse was small, sturdy, capable of surviving on sparse grass and traveling immense distances without rest. A Mongol warrior typically traveled with multiple horses, switching mounts throughout the day, allowing his string of horses to cover distances that would kill a European warhorse. These riders could live in the saddle for days. They could sleep while their horses walked. They could drink mare's milk, fermented into a slightly alcoholic beverage called airag, that sustained them on long journeys. They could open a vein in their horse's neck, drink a small amount of blood for sustenance, and seal the wound without slowing their pace. This was not cruelty. It was partnership. The Mongol and his horse were one being. Together, they could survive what would kill other men. Life on the steppe followed the seasons with absolute precision. In spring, as the snows melted and grass began to grow, the tribes moved their herds to summer pastures, higher ground where the animals could graze and grow fat. This was the season of foaling, when mares gave birth and the herds expanded. It was also the season of airag, when fermented mare's milk flowed freely, and the tribes celebrated the return of warmth. Summer was the season of plenty. The herds thrived. Children played in the long daylight hours. Warriors trained, racing their horses and practicing with bow and lance. This was also the season of tribal gatherings, when different clans might come together for trade, for marriages, or for war councils. Autumn brought preparation. The tribes moved toward winter pastures, lower ground protected from the worst winds. Animals were slaughtered, their meat preserved for the long dark months ahead. Felt was prepared for gear repairs. Weapons were maintained. Everything had to be ready before the snows came. Winter was survival. The temperature could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Blizzards could last for days, whiteouts where a man could freeze to death 5 steps from his jur. The tribes huddled close, sharing warmth and stories. In the worst storms, they brought their most valuable animals inside the jurs, horses and cattle, standing alongside children and elders, all breathing the same thick air, all waiting for spring. But winter was also the season of stories. Around fires fed with dried dung, the only fuel available on the treeless steppe, elders spoke of the past. They told of great khans and legendary warriors. They recited genealogies going back generations, for among the Mongols, ancestry was identity. They spoke of shamans who could speak to spirits, of Tengri, the eternal blue sky that watched over all, of the sacred mountains where heaven and earth touched. The Mongols had no written language in these early days. Their history lived in memory, passed from grandfather to grandson, from mother to daughter. Every child learned not just to survive, but to remember. To forget the past was to lose oneself. The spiritual life of the steppe was animistic, seeing spirits in everything. The wind had a spirit. The mountains had spirits. Each river, each rock formation, each ancient tree housed something beyond the physical. Shamans served as intermediaries, men and women who could enter trances and communicate with this spirit world. They healed the sick, blessed new ventures, and advised khans on matters both earthly and divine. But the Mongols were also pragmatic. When they encountered Buddhism from Tibet, Nestorian Christianity from the West, or Islam from Central Asia, they did not reject these foreign faiths. Instead, they absorbed what seemed useful and ignored the rest. This religious tolerance, or perhaps religious indifference, would later become one of the empire's defining characteristics. To the south lay China, divided into multiple kingdoms. The Jin dynasty ruled the north, descendants of Jurchen tribes who had themselves been nomadic conquerors before settling into Chinese ways. The Song dynasty controlled the prosperous south, wealthy beyond imagination, with cities of hundreds of thousands, ships that sailed across oceans, and technologies the steppe tribes could barely comprehend. These Chinese kingdoms viewed the Mongols as barbarians, troublesome nomads to be managed through a combination of trade, tribute, and military expeditions. They played the tribes against each other, supporting one khan against another, ensuring the steppe remained divided and therefore weak. To the west lay the great kingdoms of Central Asia, the Khwarezmian Empire, wealthy from controlling the Silk Road trade routes. Their cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, were centers of learning and commerce, where scholars studied mathematics and astronomy, where merchants traded goods from China to Europe, where poets composed verses in Persian that would echo through centuries. These civilizations saw themselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, and perhaps they were. They had writing, architecture, philosophy, art. They had accumulated the wisdom of ages, but they had grown comfortable, even complacent. Their armies were large but slow. Their walls were high but static. Their rulers were sophisticated but soft. The steppe tribes, by contrast, had nothing and everything. They had no cities to defend, no walls to maintain, no wealth to protect. They could move faster than any army. They could survive on almost nothing. And they were hungry, not just for food or plunder, but for something deeper, for recognition, for respect, for a place in a world that had always dismissed them as savages. All that was needed was someone to unite them, to channel their violence outward instead of inward, to transform them from competing tribes into a single force. That someone was being forged in hardship, in betrayal, in the harsh crucible of the steppe itself. His childhood name was Temüjin, and his story, The story of how a boy with nothing became the man who would conquer everything. That story begins in darkness and blood. But we shall save that tale for our next chapter. For now, breathe deeply and picture those endless grasslands, rolling toward infinity, waiting for the storm that would change the world forever. Chapter 2. The Rise of Temüjin. The year was 1162, and somewhere on the windswept steppe, a child was born who would change the course of human history. His name was Temüjin, and according to legend, he entered this world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. The shamans who attended his birth saw this as an omen, a sign that this child was destined to be a great warrior. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respected but not powerful, a man trying to navigate the treacherous politics of the steppe. But destiny, if it existed at all, would not make things easy for this child. Temujin's early years were relatively peaceful. He played with other children, learned to ride, and began his education in the ways of the warrior. When he was 9 years old, his father took him on a journey to find him a bride, as was the custom. They travelled to the camp of Yesugei's wife's relatives, and there they found Berta, a girl 1 year older than Temujin, bright-eyed and strong-willed. The match was agreed upon. Temujin would stay with Berta's family for a time, working for them as was traditional, earning his future wife through service. Yesugei began the journey home, pleased with the arrangement, unaware that he was riding toward his death. On the way back, Yesugei encountered a group of Tatars. The Tatars and the Mongols had been enemies for generations, locked in a blood feud that consumed both peoples. But the steppe had its rules of hospitality, and the Tatars invited Yesugei to share their meal. He accepted, not realizing too late that they had recognized him, that they remembered old grievances, that the food was poisoned. Yesugei made it home, but barely. He died in agony, and with his death, everything changed. The clan that Yesugei had led abandoned his family. This was not unusual. On the steppe, a clan followed strength, and a widow with young children had no strength. Temujin's mother, Hualun, was left with 5 children and no protection. They were outcasts now, left to survive or perish as fate decreed. What happened next revealed the character of both mother and son. Hualun refused to surrender. She gathered roots and berries, caught fish in the rivers, hunted small game. She taught her children to survive on nothing. When other families took what little they had, she fought back with words and will. She was not a warrior, but she was fierce, and her children learned from her that survival was a choice, that they could endure anything if they refused to break. Temujin, now the eldest male, took on responsibilities beyond his years. He hunted with bow and arrow, protected his younger siblings, and endured the contempt of those who had once respected his father. The steppe was harsh to the weak, and the family lived on the very edge of existence. Then came the first great crisis of Temujin's life. His half-brother, Begta, older and stronger, began asserting dominance over the family. He took food from the younger children. He challenged Temujin's authority. In a society where hierarchy meant survival, this could not stand. Temujin, probably 13 or 14 years old at the time, made a terrible decision. With his full brother Kasar, he hunted Begta down and killed him. It was murder. There is no softening this. Hualun was horrified, condemning her son for killing his own blood. But Temujin had learned a brutal lesson that would shape his entire life. Power was everything. Sentiment was weakness. To survive, one had to be willing to do what others would not. But the steppe had not finished testing him. News of the murder reached the Taichiud clan, relatives who had abandoned Temujin's family after Yesugei's death. They saw an opportunity. A young man who would kill his own brother was dangerous, unpredictable. Better to deal with him now, before he became a threat. They came in the night, captured Temujin, and made him a slave. He was fitted with a wooden collar called a kangu, a heavy device that prevented him from lying down comfortably, from fighting, from escaping. He was paraded through the camps, humiliated, a warning to others who might rise above their station. For months, he endured this, serving his captors, waiting. Then came the night of a great festival, when the Taichiud were drinking and celebrating. Temujin saw his chance. He struck his guard with the kangu itself, stunning the man, and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerging himself with only his face above water, breathing quietly while his pursuers passed nearby with torches. He might have died there, in that cold water, hunted and alone. But someone saw him. A man named Sorkin Shira, from the camp that held him captive, found Temüjin in his hiding place, and instead of calling out, instead of claiming the reward, he helped the boy. He removed the kangyu, gave him a horse and supplies, and sent him away into the night. Temüjin never forgot this kindness. Years later, when he had become powerful, he sought out Sorkin Shira and his family and rewarded them beyond measure. Loyalty, he was learning, deserved loyalty in return. He returned to his family, harder now, forged by suffering. He was perhaps 16 years old, and he had survived what should have killed him. But surviving was not enough. He needed allies. He needed power. And so he began to build, carefully and deliberately, the network that would eventually conquer the world. His first move was to claim Berta, the girl who had been promised to him. He travelled to her family's camp, and they honoured the engagement. Berta became his wife, and this marriage brought him not just a partner, but a connection to another clan, a small expansion of his influence. Then came another test. The Merkits, another steppe tribe, had a long memory. Years before, Yasuge had stolen Holan from a Merkit warrior on her wedding day, claiming her as his own wife. This was not unusual on the steppe, where women were often taken as war prizes, but the Merkits had not forgotten. They wanted revenge, and they came for it. They raided Temujin's camp, and they took Berta. For many men, this would have been the end of the story. Temüjin was still weak, still without real power, but he refused to accept defeat. Instead, he did something remarkable. He sought help from Togrul, also known as Ong Khan, the powerful leader of the Karaite tribe. Togrul had been a friend, an ally of Yasuge, and Temüjin appealed to this old bond. He also reached out to Jamuka, a childhood friend, a talented warrior who led his own band of followers. Together, these three forces mounted a rescue operation. They attacked the Merkit camp, scattered their warriors, and Temüjin reclaimed his wife. Berta was pregnant. The child, Jochi, was born months later, and there would always be whispers about his paternity. But Temüjin accepted the boy as his son, and this too revealed something about him. He was pragmatic. He understood that perception could be managed, that what mattered was not blood but loyalty. The rescue of Berta established Temüjin as a leader worth following. Warriors began to join him, young men seeking a strong Khan, families looking for protection. His camp grew. For a time, Temüjin and Jamuka were inseparable. They had sworn the oath of Anda, becoming blood brothers, promising to support each other until death. They moved their camps together, shared resources, and seemed destined to rule the steppe as partners. But two leaders cannot occupy the same space forever. The first cracks appeared over small matters, different philosophies of leadership, different visions for their people. Jamuka believed in the traditional ways, in the aristocracy of blood, in maintaining the old tribal structures. Temüjin was building something different, promoting men based on merit rather than birth, creating loyalty through reward rather than tradition. People began to choose. Some stayed with Jamuka. Others, especially those from lower clans, those with no noble blood, began to drift toward Temüjin. They saw in him a chance to rise beyond the circumstances of their birth. The break came after a raid. The details are lost to history, obscured by legend and propaganda, but the result was clear. Jamuka and Temüjin separated, and their friendship curdled into something darker. The steppe, which had known many conflicts, was about to witness something unprecedented. Temüjin began his campaign to unite the Mongol tribes under his leadership. It would take decades. It would require countless battles. It would demand brutality, brilliance, and an unwavering vision of what could be achieved. He fought the Tatars, the tribe that had killed his father, and he showed no mercy. When he defeated them, he ordered the execution of every Tatar male taller than a cart axle, effectively eliminating them as a power on the steppe. This was genocide, calculated and complete, and it sent a message to every other tribe: surrender to Temüjin, or face extinction. He fought the Merkits again, crushing them for their earlier raid on his camp. He defeated the Naimans, absorbing their warriors and their wealth. He conquered the Kerites, even though Togrul had once been his ally. When alliances no longer served his purpose, Temüjin discarded them without hesitation. And always, circling him, was Jamukha. They fought multiple battles, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Jamukha formed coalition after coalition against his former friend, rallying tribes under the banner of tradition, of the old ways, of resistance to Temujin's revolutionary vision. But Temüjin was building something that the steppe had never seen. He organized his followers not by tribal affiliation, but by military units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. A warrior's loyalty was no longer to his clan but to his unit and his Khan. He promoted based on ability, elevating talented commoners over incompetent nobles. He created a code of laws, the yasa, that applied equally to all, from the lowest soldier to the Khan himself. This was radical. This was transformative. And slowly, inexorably, it was working. By the early 1200s, Temüjin controlled most of the Mongolian plateau. The tribes that had once competed for grass and water were now unified under a single banner. And in the year 1206, the remaining Khans and chieftains gathered for a great Kurultai, a council, on the banks of the Onon River. There, they proclaimed Temüjin as Genghis Khan, often written in the West as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. He was approximately 44 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. The boy who had been abandoned, enslaved, and hunted was now the supreme leader of all the Mongol tribes. But Genghis Khan understood something that eluded most conquerors. Uniting the tribes was not the end. It was merely the beginning. The steppe was vast, but ultimately limited. The herds could only grow so large. The warriors he now commanded, these fierce horsemen who had finally stopped fighting each other, they needed a purpose. They needed an enemy. They needed conquest. And so Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward, toward the wealthy kingdoms that had always looked down upon the Mongols as barbarians. He would show them what barbarians could accomplish. He would teach the civilized world that walls and culture and centuries of tradition meant nothing against the fury of the steppe. The storm was about to break upon the world, and nothing would ever be the same. Rest now, and let these images settle in your mind. A young man rising from nothing, forging unity from chaos, transforming pain into power. This is how empires begin, not with destiny, but with will. Chapter 3. The Mongol War Machine. To understand how the Mongols conquered half the known world, we must first understand their army. It was not the largest force ever assembled, nor did it possess weapons unknown to its enemies. What made the Mongol military unstoppable was something far more profound. It was organization, discipline, and a revolutionary approach to warfare itself. The foundation of Mongol military power was the decimal system. Genghis Khan organized his army into units of 10. 10 men formed an arban, led by the most capable warrior among them. 10 arbans formed a jagun, 100 men. 10 jaguns created a mingan, 1,000 warriors. And 10 mingans comprised a tumen, the largest operational unit, consisting of 10,000 horsemen. This structure seems simple, almost obvious, but its implications were revolutionary. Every warrior knew exactly where he belonged, who commanded him, and who fought beside him. Communication flowed up and down this hierarchy with remarkable efficiency. Orders from the Khan could reach the smallest unit within hours, even across vast distances. But the true genius lay in what this system replaced. Genghis Khan had shattered the old tribal structure entirely. A warrior's arban might include men from 4 or 5 different tribes, former enemies who now depended on each other for survival. Loyalty shifted from clan to unit, from blood to brotherhood, forged in training and battle. Promotion within this system was based purely on merit. A common herder could rise to command a mingan if he proved himself capable. Conversely, a noble born to leadership could be demoted or executed for incompetence or cowardice. This was unheard of in the medieval world, where command was almost always a birthright. The punishments for failure were severe, deliberately so. If a single warrior fled from battle, his entire arban was executed. If an arban broke, the entire jagun was decimated. This created a web of mutual accountability. Every man watched his brothers, not out of distrust, but out of shared survival. Desertion became almost impossible. Cowardice meant not just personal death, but the death of everyone you fought beside. The rewards for success were equally clear. Warriors received shares of all plunder based on their rank and contributions. Genghis Khan kept relatively little for himself, understanding that a wealthy, loyal army was more valuable than a rich Khan with resentful followers. Land, women, gold, silk, livestock, all were distributed with careful attention to fairness and merit. Training was constant and rigorous. Even in peacetime, Mongol warriors practiced daily. They raced their horses across the steppe. They shot arrows at targets while riding at full gallop. They wrestled, a sport that built strength and taught men how bodies moved in combat. They practiced formations, the rapid deployment from column to line, the coordinated turns that allowed thousands of horsemen to move as one organism. The Mongol warrior was expected to maintain multiple horses, typically 4 or 5 animals per man. This allowed the army to move at speeds that shocked their enemies. While European or Chinese armies might travel 20 miles in a day, the Mongols routinely covered 60, 80, even 100 miles when necessary. They would ride one horse until it tired, switch to a fresh mount without stopping, and continue. The slower horses followed behind, resting as they moved. Each warrior carried his own supplies, eliminating the need for slow baggage trains. Dried meat and curd could sustain a man for weeks. The fermented mare's milk, airag, provided both nutrition and hydration. In extreme circumstances, as mentioned before, a warrior could open a small vein in his horse's neck, drink a cup of blood, seal the wound, and continue riding. The horse would recover. The man would survive. This was the essence of steppe pragmatism. The Mongol composite bow was perhaps their most important weapon. Made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, glued and bound together, these bows took years to construct and required immense skill to craft properly. But the result was devastating. A Mongol bow could shoot an arrow over 300 yards and could penetrate armor at closer ranges. More importantly, it could be fired from horseback with deadly accuracy. Mongol warriors trained from childhood to shoot while riding. They could shoot forward, to the sides, and even backward over their horse's rump, the famous Parthian shot that allowed them to rain arrows on pursuing enemies. A skilled archer could have 3 arrows in the air before the first struck its target. A mingan of cavalry could darken the sky with arrows, creating storms of death that devastated enemy formations before they ever came to close combat. But the Mongols were not merely horse archers. They understood combined arms warfare centuries before European armies adopted the concept. Each tumen included heavy cavalry, warriors in lamellar armor who charged with lance and sword when the moment was right. They had light cavalry for scouting and harassment. They incorporated siege engineers, learned from Chinese and Persian captives, who could construct trebuchets and other siege weapons. Intelligence gathering was perhaps the Mongols' greatest advantage. Before invading any territory, they sent merchants, travelers, and spies to gather information. They wanted to know the roads, the fortifications, the politics, the personalities of leaders, the locations of food and water. By the time a Mongol army appeared on the horizon, its commanders often knew more about the enemy's land than the enemy did. The Mongols used psychological warfare with calculated precision. They spread rumors of their own invincibility, stories deliberately exaggerated, tales of cities that resisted and were utterly destroyed. Refugees fleeing Mongol advances carried these stories to the next cities, spreading terror ahead of the actual army. Often, this terror was more effective than siege weapons. Cities would surrender without a fight, sparing themselves destruction and allowing the Mongols to conserve their forces for more difficult targets. When cities did resist, the Mongols made examples of them. The destruction was total, methodical, and deliberately publicized. Survivors were sometimes sent to neighboring cities with horrific tales, ensuring that the next target understood the consequences of resistance. This was terrorism as military strategy, and it was brutally effective. The Mongol communication system, the YAM, was another innovation that gave them immense advantage. Across their growing empire, they established stations every 20 to 30 miles. Fresh horses waited at each station, along with food and sometimes remounted messengers. A message could travel 1,000 miles in less than a week. allowing Genghis Khan to coordinate armies separated by vast distances. This system also served as an early warning network. Scouts would report enemy movements, rebellions, or opportunities. The information would race back to the Khan, who could dispatch reinforcements, redirect campaigns, or simply stay informed about events across his domains. No other medieval power possessed anything comparable. The Mongol approach to battle was flexible and adaptive. They had no single tactic, no preferred formation. Instead, they read their enemies, identified weaknesses, and exploited them. Against heavy cavalry, they would use the feigned retreat, a favorite tactic where Mongol forces would appear to break and flee, drawing impetuous knights into pursuit, separating them from their infantry, leading them into ambushes where fresh Mongol forces waited. Against infantry formations, they relied on archery, circling at a distance, peppering the enemy with arrows until the formation broke or morale collapsed. Only then would they close for melee combat. They understood that infantry, no matter how disciplined, would eventually break under sustained missile fire. Patience was a weapon. Against fortified cities, they employed both patience and innovation. They would surround a city, cutting off supplies, and simply wait. Starvation was efficient. If time was short, they would use siege weapons, learning and improving techniques from every culture they conquered. Chinese gunpowder weapons, Persian engineering, European fortification principles, all were absorbed and utilized. They also used human shields, a tactic horrifying by any standard, but terrifyingly effective. Captured civilians would be driven ahead of the attacking forces, forcing defenders to kill their own people or hold their fire. This broke morale, created chaos, and often led to rapid surrender. Genghis Khan demanded absolute honesty from his commanders. After battles, generals were required to report accurately, admitting mistakes as readily as claiming victories. The Khan did not punish honest failure if a commander had done their best. But lying, exaggerating, or hiding the truth was unforgivable. This created a culture where information flowed truthfully, allowing the Khan to make decisions based on reality rather than the filtered reports that plagued other empires. The discipline extended to treatment of conquered peoples. At least in one regard, Genghis Khan forbade his soldiers from looting until a city was fully secured. This kept the army cohesive during the crucial final stages of assault, preventing the chaos that often allowed defeated enemies to regroup. Only after complete victory could the plunder begin, and even then, it was organized and distributed according to the established hierarchy. Religious tolerance was another weapon, though the Mongols might not have recognized it as such. By allowing conquered peoples to keep their faiths, they reduced resistance. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, all were permitted to worship as they chose, so long as they submitted to Mongol authority and paid their taxes. This pragmatism won them allies among religious minorities who had suffered under previous rulers. The legal code, the yasa, applied to everyone including the Khan himself. It forbade theft among Mongols, ensured property rights, protected merchants and travelers, and established clear rules for everything from marriage to military conduct. This created predictability. Conquered peoples knew what was expected of them. Follow the rules, and you could prosper under Mongol rule. Break them, and punishment was swift and certain. Perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan fostered a culture of learning from enemies. When Mongol forces encountered a weapon or tactic they had not seen before, they studied it. Captured engineers, artisans, and military experts were not killed, but incorporated into the Mongol system. The empire became a vast repository of military knowledge, constantly evolving, always improving. This was not an army. It was a machine, self-correcting and relentlessly efficient. It turned the warriors of the steppe, men who had fought for sheep and grass, into the most formidable military force the world had ever seen. And Genghis Khan, the man who had built this machine, now pointed it at the wealthy kingdoms that surrounded the steppe. The Jin dynasty in China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. One by one, they would learn what it meant to face the Mongol war machine at its peak. The conquests were about to begin in earnest, and the world, comfortable in its ancient civilizations and mighty walls, was completely unprepared for what was coming. Let these strategies settle in your thoughts. Imagine the discipline, the coordination, the sheer organizational genius that transformed nomadic raiders into empire builders. This was how the impossible became inevitable. Chapter 4. Conquest of the East. The first target was not chosen out of ambition but necessity. The Western Xia, or Tangut Empire, occupied territory just south of Mongolia, controlling important sections of the Silk Road. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and had long played the steppe tribes against each other. More importantly, they had refused to provide troops to Genghis Khan when requested, a refusal that could not be tolerated. In the year 1205, Genghis Khan led his first major campaign beyond the steppe. The Western Xia had fortified cities, something the Mongols had little experience attacking. But what they lacked in siege expertise, they compensated for with determination and adaptability. They surrounded the Tangut cities, cut off their supply lines, and waited. When patience was insufficient, they diverted rivers, flooding cities or denying them water. They learned, experimented, and improved with each siege. The campaign lasted on and off for 2 years. The Western Xia sued for peace, offering tribute and nominal submission. Genghis Khan accepted, not because the conquest was complete, but because a larger prize had appeared on his horizon. The Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China, had made a fatal mistake. The Jin had assumed they could treat the newly unified Mongols as they had always treated steppe tribes, with a mixture of bribery and condescension. They demanded tribute. They expected submission. They did not understand that the man they were dealing with was no longer just another tribal Khan, but the leader of a transformed people who had tasted victory and hungered for more. In 1211, Genghis Khan invaded Jin territory. The Jin dynasty controlled approximately 50 million people. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They possessed fortified cities with walls 30 feet high and 10 feet thick. They had crossbows, gunpowder weapons, and 1,000 years of military tradition. On paper, the Mongols should have been crushed. But the Jin made assumptions that would prove fatal. They believed their walls were impregnable. They believed the Mongols were just raiders who would plunder the countryside and retreat when winter came. They believed cavalry could not take fortified cities. Every assumption was wrong. The Mongol invasion of Jin China was not a single campaign but a war of attrition that would last more than 20 years. Genghis Khan did not seek a quick victory. Instead, he systematically dismantled Jin power, piece by piece, city by city, demonstrating a strategic patience that his enemies never anticipated. The Mongols first swept through the countryside, destroying Jin armies in the open field. Jin cavalry and infantry, trained in traditional Chinese warfare, could not match the mobility and coordination of the Mongol Tumans. Battle after battle ended in Jin defeats. Commanders who had never faced steppe warriors discovered too late that their tactics were obsolete. Then came the cities. The Mongols began recruiting Chinese engineers, men who understood siege warfare, who could build trebuchets and siege towers, who knew the weaknesses of Chinese fortifications. These engineers were not enslaved but hired, promised wealth and position if they served effectively. Many accepted, either from pragmatism or because they bore grudges against the Jin rulers. City after city fell. Some surrendered quickly and were treated relatively well, their populations spared, their infrastructure preserved. Others resisted fiercely and were utterly destroyed as examples. The Mongols were learning to use mercy and terror as complementary tools, the carrot and stick of conquest. In 1214, the Mongols reached Zhongdu, the Jin capital, known today as Beijing. It was one of the greatest cities in the world, home to nearly 1 million people, surrounded by massive walls and defended by the Jin dynasty's best troops. The Mongols laid siege, but Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, accepted a peace offer. The Jin emperor agreed to massive tribute, including gold, silk, horses, and a princess as a bride for one of Genghis Khan's sons. The Mongols withdrew, their horses laden with plunder. The Jin emperor, relieved but humiliated, made another fatal decision. He abandoned Zhongdu and moved his capital south to Kaifeng, presumably to be farther from the Mongol threat. Genghis Khan saw this as a breach of their agreement, an insult, and proof that the Jin could not be trusted. In 1215, the Mongols returned, and this time there would be no negotiation. Zhongdu was stormed after a prolonged siege. The city burned for more than a month. The death toll was catastrophic. with estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The Mongols had learned that total destruction could be more than revenge. It could be policy. But even as the war with Jin continued, managed by his generals, Genghis Khan's attention was drawn westward. An event occurred in Central Asia that would redirect the course of Mongol expansion and ultimately prove even more significant than the conquest of China. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched across modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. It controlled the heart of the Silk Road, where trade from China flowed west toward Europe and the Mediterranean. The empire was wealthy, its cities magnificent, its Shah, Muhammad II, commanded armies in the hundreds of thousands. Genghis Khan initially sought trade and peaceful relations with the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1218, he sent a caravan of approximately 450 merchants, many of them Muslim, carrying valuable goods and a message of friendship. The caravan reached the city of Otrar, on the border of the empire. What happened next would seal the fate of millions. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, either suspecting the merchants were spies or simply motivated by greed, seized the caravan's goods and executed the merchants. Every single one. When news reached Genghis Khan, he sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad requesting justice, the extradition of the governor, and restitution for the losses. Shah Muhammad, fatally misjudging the situation, not only refused but executed the lead Mongol ambassador and sent the others back with their beards burned off, a deliberate insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. This was war. Not a war for conquest, at least not initially, but a war for retribution. Genghis Khan spent a year preparing, gathering intelligence about the Khwarezmian Empire, its cities, its armies, its internal divisions. By 1219, he was ready. The Mongol invasion force was smaller than the Khwarezmian armies, probably numbering between 100,000 and 150,000 warriors, but it included Genghis Khan's best generals and most experienced troops. They brought with them Chinese siege engineers, ready to tackle the great cities of Central Asia. The campaign that followed was one of the most devastating in human history. The Mongols divided into several forces, a strategy that seemed suicidal against a numerically superior enemy, but which proved brilliant in execution. Genghis Khan understood that Shah Muhammad's strength was also his weakness. The Khwarezmian army was scattered across dozens of garrison cities. If the Mongols moved fast enough, they could defeat these garrisons piecemeal before they could concentrate. The city of Otrar, where the merchants had been killed, was besieged and taken after 5 months. Governor Inalchuk was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment for his greed and the blindness that had triggered this catastrophe. But Otrar was just the beginning. The Mongol forces moved like a coordinated storm across Central Asia. Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, was taken in 1220. The Mongols spared the population but destroyed the city's fortifications and forced the young men into their army as cannon fodder for the next siege. When Genghis Khan entered Bukhara, he reportedly rode into the main mosque and told the assembled people that he was the punishment of God sent for their sins. Whether he actually said this or whether it was later propaganda, the statement captured how many Muslims interpreted the disaster befalling them. This was divine retribution for the decadence and internal squabbles that had weakened the Islamic world. Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, fell after only 5 days. The city had approximately 100,000 defenders, but they were demoralized, leaderless, and faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The Mongols used captured civilians as human shields, driving them ahead of the assault. The city's Turkish garrison tried to break out but was slaughtered. The artisans and craftsmen of Samarkand were spared and deported to Mongolia, where their skills would serve their conquerors. The rest faced varying fates, depending on whether they had resisted or cooperated. Shah Muhammad fled before the Mongol advance, abandoning his armies and people. Genghis Khan dispatched 2 of his greatest generals, Jebe and Subutai, with 20,000 men to hunt him down. What followed was one of the most remarkable pursuits in military history. The 2 generals chased Shah Muhammad across Persia, modern-day Iran, covering thousands of miles, destroying any city that gave him shelter, scattering any forces that tried to protect him. The Shah fled from city to city, always one step ahead, until finally he took refuge on an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died, probably from pneumonia, exhausted and broken. His empire had collapsed around him in less than 2 years. Meanwhile, other Mongol forces were systematically reducing the great cities of Central Asia. Urgench, the capital, resisted fiercely for 7 months. When it finally fell, the Mongols diverted the Amu Darya River through it, erasing the city from existence. Merv, reputedly one of the world's largest cities at the time, surrendered and was then betrayed. The Mongols massacred the population, killing by some estimates 700,000 people over the course of several days. The numbers from this campaign are difficult to verify and were certainly exaggerated by medieval chroniclers seeking to emphasize Mongol brutality. But even accounting for exaggeration, the devastation was unprecedented. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ruins. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were destroyed and never rebuilt. The population of Central Asia may have declined by 70 to 80%. Some regions would not recover for centuries. But the campaign also revealed another aspect of Mongol rule. Cities that surrendered peacefully were often treated well. Scholars, scientists, artists, and craftsmen were identified and protected. The Mongols had no interest in destroying knowledge or skill, only resistance. In Samarkand and Bukhara, they spared the Muslim scholars and even debated with them about religion and philosophy. Genghis Khan was illiterate but intellectually curious, fascinated by the ideas of the civilized world he was conquering. After Shah Muhammad's death, his son Jalal ad-Din attempted to rally resistance. He proved more capable than his father, actually defeating a Mongol force in battle, one of the few commanders to achieve this. But ultimately, he too was hunted down. In 1221, Genghis Khan himself confronted Jalal ad-Din's army at the Indus River. The battle was fierce, but the Mongols prevailed. Jalal ad-Din escaped by riding his horse off a cliff into the river below and swimming to safety. Genghis Khan, watching from the riverbank, reportedly saluted his enemy's courage. The Khwarezmian Empire was finished. Its cities lay in ruins. Its population was dead, enslaved, or scattered. The heart of Central Asia had been transformed from one of the world's most prosperous regions into a landscape of desolation. Meanwhile, Jebe and Subutai, having completed their pursuit of Shah Muhammad, did not return directly to Mongolia. Instead, with Genghis Khan's permission, they continued westward on a reconnaissance mission that would take them around the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus Mountains, and into the southern Russian steppes. This force of only 20,000 men defeated Georgian armies, ravaged Azerbaijan, and then burst into the territory of the Kipchak Turks and the Rus princes of what would become Russia and Ukraine. At the Kalka River in 1223, they encountered a combined force of Rus princes and Kipchak allies, perhaps 80,000 strong. The Battle of Kalka River was a masterpiece of Mongol tactics. They used feigned retreats to draw the overconfident Rus and Kipchak forces into pursuit, then turned and destroyed them piecemeal. The Russian princes were captured, and in a particularly cruel display, they were placed under heavy boards. The Mongol commanders then held a victory feast on top of these boards, slowly crushing the princes to death while they celebrated. This was psychological warfare at its most extreme, a message to any who would resist. But it was also reconnaissance. The Mongols now knew the routes into Eastern Europe, the strength of its armies, the weaknesses of its political divisions. They would return, but not yet. By 1225, Genghis Khan was back in Mongolia, having conquered an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. He had destroyed 2 major dynasties and dozens of kingdoms. He had demonstrated that no wall, no army, no civilization was safe from Mongol power. But the old Khan was not finished. The Western Xia, his first target, had failed to provide promised troops during the Central Asian campaign. This betrayal could not stand. In 1226, despite being nearly 65 years old, Genghis Khan personally led another invasion of Western Xia. The campaign was successful but would prove his last. In 1227, under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse, possibly from illness, Genghis Khan died. His death was kept secret during the final assault on the Western Xia capital. When the city fell, the entire population was massacred in accordance with the dead Khan's final orders. The Western Xia ceased to exist as a people and a culture. This was Genghis Khan's parting message to the world. "Keep your promises to the Mongols, or face extinction." His body was transported back to Mongolia and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere near the mountain he had designated sacred. The exact location remains unknown to this day. According to legend, anyone who witnessed the funeral procession was killed to preserve the secret. Even in death, Genghis Khan maintained an aura of mystery and power. He had lived for approximately 65 years. He had risen from absolute poverty to absolute power. He had transformed the Mongol tribes from perpetually warring clans into a unified force. He had conquered an empire larger than any that had come before. And he had done it through a combination of strategic brilliance, brutal pragmatism, and an unshakable belief that he was destined to rule the world. But the empire he built was not finished growing. His sons and grandsons would expand it even further, carrying Mongol power into Europe, the Middle East, and southern China. The storm that Genghis Khan had unleashed would continue to reshape the world for decades after his death. Rest now, and consider the magnitude of what one man accomplished. From nothing to everything, from the steppes to the cities, from obscurity to immortality. This was the legacy of Temüjin, who became Genghis Khan, the conqueror of the East and the architect of an empire that would never be equaled in size or speed of expansion. Chapter 5. Westward into Europe. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 did not slow the Mongol advance. If anything, it accelerated. His successors understood that the empire's survival depended on continued expansion, on maintaining the momentum that had carried them across Asia. The warriors who had conquered the East now turned their eyes westward, toward the forests and plains of Europe. But first came the question of succession. According to Mongol tradition, a Kurultai, a great assembly of princes and commanders, would choose the next great Khan. Genghis Khan had 4 legitimate sons by his wife Berta. Jochi, the eldest, had died before his father, his relationship with Genghis Khan complicated by those persistent questions about his paternity. Chagatai, the second son, was brave but hot-tempered and had already been passed over. Tolui, the youngest, was a brilliant general, but served as regent temporarily. The choice fell to Ögedei, the third son, who had proven himself both competent in battle and skilled in administration. In 1229, Ögedei was formally proclaimed Great Khan. He established his capital at Karakorum, transforming a minor settlement in the Mongolian heartland into a center of imperial power. While not as magnificent as the Chinese or Persian cities the Mongols had conquered, Karakorum became a remarkable place, a crossroads where envoys from dozens of nations gathered, where Christian priests debated with Buddhist monks and Muslim scholars, where goods from every corner of the known world changed hands. Ögedei understood something his father had known instinctively. An empire this vast could not be ruled by terror alone. He invested in infrastructure, establishing the YAM system of relay stations across all Mongol territories. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. He reduced some taxes to encourage economic recovery in conquered regions. He was still ruthless when necessary, but he balanced destruction with construction. But the Mongol military tradition demanded conquest, and Europe beckoned. The decision to invade Europe was made at a Kurultai in 1235. Ögedei assigned the campaign to his nephew Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan through Jochi's line. This was both an honor and a test. Batu would lead the largest Mongol army ever assembled for a single campaign, but he would do so under the watchful guidance of Subutai, now nearly 60 years old, but still the greatest military mind in the Mongol Empire. The invasion force that gathered in 1236 was extraordinary. Estimates suggest between 150,000 to 200,000 warriors drawn from across the empire. This was not just Mongols but Turks, Chinese engineers, Korean artisans, and auxiliaries from dozens of conquered peoples. It was a truly imperial army, a demonstration of the Mongol ability to absorb and utilize the resources of their vast domains. The initial target was not Europe proper but the territories that lay between, the lands controlled by the Volga Bulgars and various Rus principalities. These were Christian states, orthodox in faith, loosely connected by religion and trade but politically fragmented. They had heard reports of the Mongols, but the defeats at Kalka River, 14 years earlier, seemed like a distant nightmare, easily dismissed or forgotten. In 1237, the Mongol invasion began. The first major city to fall was Ryazan, a prosperous principality in northeastern Russia. The Mongols sent envoys demanding submission and tribute. The Prince of Ryazan refused, reportedly saying he would only pay tribute when he and all his people were dead. The Mongols obliged him. After a 5-day siege, Ryazan was stormed. The population was massacred. The city was burned so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt on the same site. The prince and his family were killed to the last member. This was the pattern that would repeat across Russia. The Mongols moved in winter, when the rivers and swamps that normally protected the Rus cities were frozen solid, turning obstacles into highways for cavalry. European armies avoided winter campaigns, but the Mongols thrived in them. They were steppe people, accustomed to brutal cold, and they used the weather as a weapon. Vladimir, another major principality, fell in 1238 after a brief siege. The Grand Prince had fled, but his family remained behind. They took refuge in the city's cathedral. The Mongols set fire to it, burning everyone inside alive. Such atrocities were not mindless cruelty, but calculated terror, designed to break the will of the next city before the siege even began. City after city fell throughout 1238 and 1239. Moscow, then a minor town, was burned. Kozelsk, defended stubbornly for 7 weeks by its young prince and population, was eventually taken and its entire population killed, the Mongols calling it the evil city for the casualties it inflicted on them. Chernigov, Pereyaslav, all the great Rus cities, one by one they fell or surrendered. The survivors fled west, carrying tales of an invincible horde, of warriors who could shoot arrows with impossible accuracy, who could appear from nowhere and disappear like ghosts, who showed no mercy and accepted no surrender except on their terms. These refugees spread panic throughout Eastern Europe, preparing the ground for what was to come. In December of 1240, the Mongols reached Kiev, the most important city in all the Rus lands, the mother of Russian cities, the spiritual heart of Orthodox Christianity in the region. Kiev's walls were strong, its garrison determined. The prince, Mikhail of Chernigov, had fled, but the city's military governor, Dmitro, refused Mongol surrender demands. The siege lasted 3 months. The Mongols deployed their full arsenal of siege weapons, catapults, and trebuchets that hurled stones and incendiaries against Kiev's walls. Chinese engineers directed the assault with methodical precision. Day after day, the bombardment continued. Finally, in early 1241, a section of wall collapsed. The Mongols poured through. What followed was 3 days of systematic destruction. The population was slaughtered or enslaved. The churches, including the great cathedral of St. Sophia, were looted and partially destroyed. When a Franciscan friar, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, visited Kiev 6 years later, he reported finding countless skulls and bones scattered across the ruins. The city that had been home to perhaps 50,000 people was reduced to a handful of survivors living among the ruins. Eastern Europe was finished, but the Mongols were not done. Batu Khan and Subutai divided their forces, preparing for a 2-pronged invasion of Central Europe. One force would attack Poland. The other would strike Hungary. The timing would be coordinated, the forces separated by hundreds of miles, yet moving in concert, a demonstration of military coordination unprecedented in medieval warfare. In March of 1241, the Mongol invasion of Poland began. The Polish dukes, warned by refugees from Russia, attempted to gather their forces. Duke Henry II of Silesia assembled an army of perhaps 25,000 men, including Polish knights, Teutonic knights, and various infantry contingents. He marched to meet the Mongol force, confident that European heavy cavalry would prove superior to steppe horsemen. The armies met at Legnica, known in Polish as Legnica, on April 9, 1241. The battle began with a Mongol tactic that had worked countless times before. Their light cavalry skirmished with the European forces, firing arrows and retreating. Duke Henry ordered his knights to charge. The Mongols fled. The knights, triumphant, pursued. They were being led into a trap. Once the knights were separated from their infantry, stretched out in pursuit, the Mongol forces turned. Fresh cavalry appeared from hidden positions. The knights found themselves surrounded, their heavy armor useless against the speed and archery of the Mongol horsemen. They were systematically destroyed. Duke Henry attempted to flee but was captured and executed. The Mongols cut off his head and paraded it on a lance. They also reportedly cut an ear from each dead European soldier, filling 9 large sacks with ears to send back as proof of their victory. Whether this actually occurred or was exaggeration, it became part of the legend of Mongol savagery that terrified Europe. But Legnica was not the decisive battle. It was a diversion. The main Mongol force, led by Batu Khan and Subutai, was in Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary had received refugees from the Cumans, a Turkic people fleeing the Mongol advance. This gave the Mongols their pretext for invasion, demanding that Hungary surrender the Cumans. Bela refused. War was inevitable. The Hungarian army was one of the largest in Europe, perhaps 70,000 strong, including heavy cavalry, crossbowmen, and infantry from various kingdoms. King Bela was confident. His force outnumbered the Mongols, or so he believed. He marched to meet them at the Sajó River in northeastern Hungary. The Battle of Mohi, fought on April 11th, 1241, just 2 days after Legnica, would prove to be one of the most decisive battles in European history. The Hungarian army camped near the river, with the Sajó protecting one flank. It seemed a strong defensive position. But during the night of April 10th, Mongol forces quietly constructed a bridge downstream and crossed the river undetected. Meanwhile, another force engaged the Hungarians at the main bridge, making them believe this was the primary threat. At dawn, the Mongols attacked from multiple directions. The Hungarians, suddenly finding themselves flanked and surrounded, tried to form defensive positions. But the Mongol strategy was more subtle than simple encirclement. Subutai had deliberately left one direction open, an apparent escape route to the west. As the battle intensified and the Hungarian position became increasingly desperate, soldiers began to flee through this gap. At first it was a trickle, then a flood. The army dissolved into a panicked mob, streaming westward, away from the battle. This was exactly what Subutai had planned. Once the Hungarians were in full retreat, strung out along the roads, disorganized and demoralized, the Mongol light cavalry pursued. For miles, they hunted the fleeing soldiers, shooting them down with arrows, running them into swamps and forests. The massacre continued for 2 days. Of the 70,000 Hungarians who had marched to battle, perhaps only 15 to 20,000 survived. King Bela himself barely escaped, fleeing to the Adriatic coast. Hungary lay open. The Mongols spread across the country, burning towns, destroying fortifications, and carrying away captives. They reached the outskirts of Vienna. Mongol scouts were reported in the suburbs of Venice. Europe, which had crushed the Muslims in the Crusades, which had conquered much of the known world through colonization and trade, now faced an enemy it could not comprehend or defeat. Panic spread across the continent. The Pope called for a crusade against the Mongols, but the response was minimal. Europe was divided, the kingdoms suspicious of each other, the Holy Roman Empire in turmoil. There was no unified response, no coordinated defense. If the Mongols chose to continue westward, there was little that could stop them. But they did not continue. In December of 1241, news reached Batu Khan in Hungary. Ogedei, the great Khan, had died. Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would choose the next Khan. Batu, as a senior prince, had to attend or risk losing influence over the succession. The Mongol armies withdrew from Hungary and Poland, moving back eastward. Europe, which had been holding its breath, began to breathe again. But the Mongols did not leave Europe entirely. Batu Khan established his headquarters on the Volga River, creating what became known as the Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that would dominate Russia and the western steppes for more than 2 centuries. The question that has haunted historians ever since is simple. What if Ogedei had not died? What if the Mongol invasion of Europe had continued? The military situation suggests Europe would have fallen. No single kingdom could match Mongol military skill. The political divisions of Europe meant no unified defense was possible. The Mongol forces, though smaller than Europe's combined armies, were more mobile, better coordinated, and led by superior generals. Cities would have fallen one by one, just as they had in Russia, China, and Central Asia. But the Mongols also faced challenges. Europe's climate was wetter, its forests denser, its terrain less suited to cavalry warfare than the open steppes of Asia. The further west the Mongols advanced, the longer their supply lines became, the more difficult coordination across vast distances. Europe's castle-based feudal system might have proved more resilient than the centralized kingdoms of the East, requiring the Mongols to conduct hundreds of small sieges rather than a few decisive battles. We will never know. The death of one man, Ögedei Khan, thousands of miles away in Mongolia, saved Europe from conquest. It was chance, not European military prowess, that halted the Mongol advance. But the impact on Russia was permanent. The Mongols imposed what Russians would call the Tatar yoke, a system of indirect rule that lasted until the late 15th century. Russian princes had to travel to the Golden Horde to receive patents confirming their authority. They paid heavy tribute. They provided troops when demanded. Russian development diverged from Western Europe during these centuries, isolated and controlled by Mongol power. The Mongol withdrawal from Central Europe also demonstrated something important about the empire. For all its military might, it was fundamentally shaped by steppe politics and traditions. The death of a Khan meant uncertainty, meant potential civil war, meant that ambitious princes had to be present in Mongolia to protect their interests. The empire was vast, but still centered on the distant grasslands where it had begun. Batu Khan never returned to Central Europe. He consolidated his control over the Western territories, built his capital at Sarai on the Volga, and created a semi-independent Khanate within the larger Mongol Empire. The Golden Horde would persist long after the empire itself fragmented, lasting until the 16th century, a testament to the enduring impact of Mongol conquest. Europe had faced the storm and survived, but barely, and more by luck than by strength. The Mongols had demonstrated they could defeat any European army in open battle. They had shown that walls and castles could be overcome. They had proven that distance was no obstacle to coordinated military operations. The world had changed. Europe, which had considered itself the center of civilization, had been reminded that power could come from unexpected places, that empires could rise from the steppes, that the people they dismissed as barbarians could bring kingdoms to their knees. And in Mongolia, far from the battlefields of Europe, another succession crisis was beginning, one that would shape the next phase of Mongol expansion and ultimately determine whether the empire would remain unified or fracture into competing khanates. Let your mind rest on these images. Vast armies moving across frozen rivers, cities burning in the winter darkness, kings fleeing before horsemen from the distant east. This was the moment when Europe faced the possibility of its own conquest, when the world as they knew it almost ended. Sleep now, and remember how close history came to taking a different path entirely. Chapter 6. The Great Khans. The death of Ögedei Khan in December of 1241 left the Mongol Empire without a clear leader at the height of its expansion. For a civilization built on conquest and constant forward momentum, this was more than a political problem. It was an existential crisis. The succession should have been straightforward. Ögedei had designated his grandson Shai-Ramun as his heir, but Mongol succession was never truly automatic. The Kurultai, the great assembly of princes and military commanders, held the real power to choose the next Khan, and the princes who gathered in Karakorum in 1242 had their own ambitions, their own candidates, their own visions for the empire's future. Ögedei's widow, Turagene Khatun, moved quickly to secure power for her own son, Guyuk, rather than the designated grandson. She acted as regent, effectively ruling the empire for 5 years, while she maneuvered, built alliances, removed opponents, and prepared for Guyuk's elevation. This period revealed something remarkable about Mongol society. Women could wield enormous power, serving as regents, managing territories, and influencing succession disputes. The steppe traditions had not been entirely erased by empire. Finally, in 1246, a Kurultai formally elected Guyuk as Great Khan. He was Ögedei's eldest surviving son, a capable military commander who had served in the European campaigns. But his reign would prove brief and troubled. Guyuk harbored deep resentments, particularly against Batu Khan, the ruler of the Golden Horde. The two men had clashed during the invasion of Europe, their relationship poisoned by rivalry and perceived insults. As Great Khan, Guyuk began preparing for what appeared to be a military campaign against Batu, a move that would have plunged the empire into civil war. But in 1248, while travelling westward with his army, Guyuk died. The circumstances remain mysterious. Some sources suggest natural causes, perhaps heart problems or alcoholism, afflictions common among the Mongol nobility. Others hint at poison, perhaps arranged by Batu's allies, who recognized the danger of internal conflict. Whatever the cause, Guyuk's death after less than 2 years as Khan prevented the empire from tearing itself apart. Once again, a regency followed. Guyuk's widow, Ogul Kaimish, attempted to rule as her predecessor had done, but she lacked Turagane's political skill. The empire drifted without strong leadership for 3 years, its expansion slowing, its administration becoming increasingly dysfunctional. The deadlock was finally broken in 1251, when a Kurultai elected Mongke, the eldest son of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son. This marked a shift in power from Ögedei's line to Tolui's line, a change that had been building through careful alliance building and the support of Batu Khan, who had become a kingmaker despite never seeking the supreme position himself. Mongke Khan proved to be one of the most capable rulers in Mongol history. He was intelligent, disciplined, and deeply committed to the imperial project his grandfather had begun. Unlike some of his predecessors, Mongke lived relatively simply, avoiding the excesses that had begun to corrupt the Mongol elite. He rose early, worked tirelessly, and held his administrators to strict standards of honesty and competence. One of his first acts was to conduct a purge of corruption. The years of weak leadership had allowed officials to embezzle, to falsify records, to abuse their power. Mongke ordered a comprehensive audit of the empire's finances. Those found guilty of corruption were executed, regardless of their rank or family connections. This was not cruelty but governance, an attempt to restore the meritocratic principles that Genghis Khan had established. Mongke also ordered a census of the entire empire, an administrative achievement of staggering scope. Officials travelled to every corner of Mongol territory, counting populations, assessing resources, and establishing tax rolls. This census allowed for more efficient taxation and military recruitment, but it also demonstrated the empire's organizational capacity. No previous empire had attempted such comprehensive record-keeping across such vast territories. But Mongke was a grandson of Genghis Khan, and that meant conquest remained central to his vision. The empire had 2 major, unfinished projects. The Jin dynasty in northern China had fallen, but the Song dynasty still controlled southern China. In the west, the Islamic heartlands of Persia and the Middle East remained unconquered. Mongke determined to complete both conquests simultaneously. For the Chinese campaign, he appointed his younger brother Kubilai, a man who had shown both military skill and intellectual curiosity. Kubilai had studied Chinese culture, employed Chinese advisors, and understood that conquering China required more than military force. It required winning over the population, offering stability and prosperity under Mongol rule. For the Western campaign, Mongke chose another brother, Hulagu. This assignment was equally significant, for it meant confronting the Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic center of the Islamic world, and the network of states that surrounded it. The southern Song dynasty was wealthy beyond imagination. Its cities, particularly Hangzhou, were among the largest and most sophisticated in the world. The Song had gunpowder weapons, advanced naval forces, and a tradition of bureaucratic governance that had survived 1,000 years. They also had natural defenses. Southern China was a land of rivers, mountains, and rice paddies, terrain that greatly favored defense over the cavalry-based warfare at which the Mongols excelled. Kubilai's campaign, which began in earnest in 1253, would take more than 20 years to complete. It was not a single invasion but a methodical advance, securing territory, establishing administration, building alliances with Chinese factions, and slowly encircling the Song capital. This required patience, adaptability, and a willingness to learn. Kubilai employed Chinese generals, adopted Chinese siege techniques, and even built a navy, something unprecedented for the Mongols. But while Kubilai's campaign would unfold over decades, Hulagu's western expedition produced more immediate and dramatic results. In 1253, Hulagu departed Mongolia with perhaps 150,000 warriors, one of the largest armies the empire had ever assembled. His orders from Mongke were clear. subdue Persia completely, destroy the assassins, a mysterious Islamic sect that had terrorized the region for decades, and conquer Baghdad, ending the Abbasid Caliphate. The assassins were Hulagu's first target. They controlled a network of mountain fortresses in northern Persia, most famously Alamut, and seemingly impregnable castle perched on a crag. The assassins had survived for over a century through a combination of military skill, strategic fortifications, and their willingness to use targeted killings against their enemies. They had assassinated kings, generals, and religious leaders. Even the Mongols had initially hesitated to confront them directly. But Hulagu was systematic and patient. He brought Chinese siege engineers and the full weight of Mongol military power. One by one, the assassin fortresses fell. Alamut itself, which had never been taken by assault, surrendered in 1256 after a brief siege demonstrated the futility of resistance. The assassin leader, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, was executed. The order was effectively destroyed, its power broken forever. With the assassins eliminated, Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. Baghdad, in the mid-13th century, was past its golden age, but remained enormously significant. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world, at least symbolically, for 5 centuries. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's family and served as the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. The city itself, though diminished from its peak, still housed perhaps 500,000 people, magnificent libraries, and architectural wonders. Hulagu sent envoys to al-Mustasim demanding submission. The Caliph, advised by ministers who fatally underestimated Mongol power, refused. He believed Baghdad's walls were strong enough to withstand any siege. He trusted that the Mongol army would fragment or withdraw as winter approached. He assumed that the Muslim world would rally to defend its holy city. Every assumption proved wrong. The Mongol army arrived at Baghdad in January of 1258. They surrounded the city completely, cutting off all routes of escape or supply. Chinese engineers constructed siege weapons and began a methodical bombardment. The walls, impressive by medieval standards, began to crumble under sustained assault. Inside Baghdad, the population realized too late the magnitude of their danger. The Caliph attempted to negotiate, but Hulagu had no interest in compromise. The refusal to surrender peacefully had sealed the city's fate. On February 5, 1258, after less than 2 weeks of siege, the walls were breached. What followed was one of the great catastrophes in Islamic history. The Mongol army poured into Baghdad with orders to show no mercy. For nearly a week, they systematically destroyed the city. The population was massacred, with estimates of the dead ranging from 200,000 to perhaps 800,000, though precise numbers are impossible to verify. The great libraries, which housed centuries of Islamic scholarship, were destroyed. Books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the river reportedly ran black with ink. The House of Wisdom, the legendary center of learning that had preserved Greek philosophy and advanced Islamic science, was demolished. The Caliph himself was captured and, according to tradition, executed by being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a method that avoided spilling royal blood, which the Mongols considered taboo. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured since 750, came to an end. The Islamic world lost its symbolic center, its spiritual authority fragmented among competing dynasties and scholars. The destruction of Baghdad shocked the medieval world. For Muslims, it was an apocalyptic event, comparable to the sack of Rome or Jerusalem. Many Islamic scholars interpreted it as divine punishment, questioning what sins had led God to permit such devastation. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad and other Islamic cities during this campaign had lasting effects on Islamic civilization, ending the golden age of Islamic science and philosophy that had flourished for centuries. But Hulagu was not finished. His army continued westward into Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus. For a moment, it seemed the Mongols might conquer Egypt and North Africa as well, potentially absorbing the entire Islamic world into their empire. Then came news from Mongolia. In 1259, Mongol Khan had died while campaigning in southern China. Like his predecessors, he had been actively engaged in conquest when death found him, possibly from disease, possibly from wounds. The sources disagree. And like before, his death created a succession crisis. Hulagu faced the same dilemma that had confronted Batu Khan 18 years earlier. Mongol law required him to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai. But Hulagu was thousands of miles from home, his army deep in hostile territory, his conquests incomplete. He made a calculated decision. He would send representatives to the Kurultai, but remain in the Middle East to secure his gains. He left a reduced force in Syria under one of his generals, Kitbuka, and withdrew the bulk of his army to Persia. This decision would have profound consequences. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which had been preparing defences against the Mongol threat, saw an opportunity. They marched north with their army and encountered Kitbuka's much smaller Mongol force at Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel. The Battle of Ain Jalut, fought on September 3, 1260, was one of the most significant battles in medieval history. The Mamluks, who were themselves former slaves trained as elite warriors, defeated the Mongol army decisively. Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mongol advance into the Middle East was halted. This was the first major defeat of a Mongol army in open battle since Genghis Khan had begun his conquests. It demonstrated that the Mongols were not invincible, that they could be defeated by determined and skilled opponents. More importantly, it established a permanent frontier. The Mongols would never conquer Egypt or North Africa. The Islamic world, though devastated and transformed, would survive as an independent civilization. Meanwhile, in Mongolia and China, the succession crisis was evolving into something more dangerous. Two of Mungka's brothers, Kubilai and Arik Bök, both claimed the title of Great Khan. Kubilai was in China, leading the campaign against the Song dynasty. Arik Bök was in Mongolia, controlling the traditional heartland and presenting himself as the defender of Mongol traditions against the corrupting influence of Chinese civilization. For the first time, the Mongol Empire faced full civil war between major factions. The conflict between Kubilai and Arik Bök would last 4 years, from 1260 to 1264, draining resources and dividing loyalties. Ultimately, Kubilai's superior resources and control of China's wealth allowed him to prevail. Arik Bök surrendered and was imprisoned, dying under mysterious circumstances shortly after. But the price of victory was the empire's unity. Kubilai was acknowledged as Great Khan in Mongolia and China, but the other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and now Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia, effectively became independent. They still acknowledged nominal allegiance to the Great Khan, but in practice, the Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 separate states. The age of unified Mongol expansion was over. What came next was something different. 4 distinct empires, each shaped by the regions they controlled, each developing its own character and eventually its own destiny. Kubilai Khan, who would prove to be the most famous of Genghis Khan's grandsons, now faced the challenge of ruling China while maintaining Mongol identity. His story, and the story of the Yuan dynasty he would create, would define the next chapter of Mongol history. But for now, rest in the knowledge that empires, no matter how powerful, contain the seeds of their own transformation. The Mongols had conquered the world, only to discover that the world would also conquer them, changing them in ways both subtle and profound. Sleep and dream of turning points, of battles won and lost, of brothers fighting brothers, of an empire reaching its zenith even as it began to fragment. Chapter 7. Kubilai and the Yuan dynasty. Kubilai Khan stood at a crossroads between 2 worlds. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan, raised in the traditions of the steppe, trained in the arts of war and horsemanship. But he was also a man fascinated by Chinese civilization, educated by Confucian scholars, advised by Buddhist monks, and deeply engaged with the sophisticated culture he was conquering. This duality would define his reign and transform the Mongol Empire into something his grandfather could never have imagined. Born in 1215, Kubilai was the 4th son of Tolui and Sorgatani Beki, one of the most remarkable women in Mongol history. Sorgatani was a Nestorian Christian, intelligent and politically astute, who ensured her sons received educations that went far beyond traditional Mongol warrior training. She hired Chinese tutors, exposed her children to multiple religions and philosophies, and prepared them for leadership in an empire that was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan. Kubilai absorbed these lessons, Unlike many Mongol princes who viewed conquered peoples with contempt, he saw them as resources to be utilized, cultures to be learned from, and potential partners in governance. This perspective made him controversial among traditional Mongols, who feared he was abandoning the ways of the steppe. But it also made him uniquely suited to rule China. When Mongol Khan assigned him the conquest of southern China in the early 1250s, Kubilai approached the task with characteristic thoughtfulness. The Song dynasty was not like the kingdoms his grandfather had conquered. It could not be simply overwhelmed by cavalry charges and terror. It required a different strategy, one that combined military pressure with political seduction. Kubilai established his base in northern China and began building the administrative infrastructure for a Chinese-style state. He recruited Chinese officials, many of them former Song bureaucrats who had surrendered or been captured. He offered them positions, salaries, and respect, treating them as valuable assets rather than conquered enemies. This was revolutionary. Traditional Mongol practice was to reward warriors with land and captives. Kubilai instead built a bureaucracy. He also cultivated relationships with Chinese intellectuals, particularly Buddhists and Confucian scholars. He debated philosophy with them, sought their advice on governance, and patronized their temples and schools. When traditional Mongols criticized him for this, he argued pragmatically. China was too large and complex to be ruled by force alone. Winning the hearts and minds of the educated class would make governance easier and conquest more lasting. But Kubilai was still a Mongol military commander, and the Song dynasty would not surrender willingly. The campaign in southern China was among the longest and most difficult in Mongol history. It involved fighting in terrain completely unsuited to cavalry warfare: rice paddies, rivers, mountains, and fortified cities, defended by sophisticated Song armies equipped with gunpowder weapons, crossbows, and strong naval forces. Kubilai adapted. He recruited Chinese naval commanders and shipbuilders, creating a Mongol navy from scratch. This was unprecedented. The Mongols were horsemen, their entire military tradition centered on cavalry. But Kubilai understood that tradition must sometimes bend to necessity. By the early 1270s, he commanded a fleet capable of challenging Song naval power. He also employed siege warfare with patience that earlier Mongol campaigns had rarely shown. Cities were surrounded and starved rather than immediately assaulted. Diplomacy was used alongside military force, offering generous terms to Song officials who surrendered, harsh punishment for those who resisted. Slowly, methodically, the Song territories contracted. But the conquest of China was interrupted by the succession crisis following Mongol's death. When Kubilai declared himself Great Khan in 1260, not all Mongols accepted his authority. His younger brother Arik Boke, based in Karakoram, claimed the title as well, arguing that Kubilai had been corrupted by Chinese influence and no longer represented true Mongol values. The civil war that followed revealed the empire's growing divisions. Arik Boke represented traditional Mongol interests, the warriors who wanted to preserve steppe culture and resist the corrupting influence of settled civilizations. Kubilai represented a more cosmopolitan vision, an empire that absorbed and utilized the strengths of all its conquered peoples. The war lasted 4 years and was fought primarily through maneuvering, alliance building, and control of resources rather than massive battles. Kubilai's position in China gave him access to enormous wealth, grain, silk, and the sophisticated Chinese economy. He used this wealth to buy loyalty, provision armies, and outlast his brother. Arik Boke, based in Mongolia with limited resources, gradually weakened. In 1264, Arik Boke surrendered. Kubilai treated him with relative mercy, not executing him immediately but keeping him under house arrest. Arik Boke died 2 years later, under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly from illness, possibly from poison administered by Kubilai's agents. With his death, Kubilai's position as Great Khan was secure, at least in Mongolia and China. But the other Mongol Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, were effectively independent now. They acknowledged Kubilai nominally, but made their own decisions, pursued their own policies, and sometimes fought among themselves. The unified Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan had created no longer existed in practice. Kubilai accepted this reality and focused on what he could control. In 1271, he took a momentous step. He declared the founding of a new Chinese dynasty, the Yuan. with himself as emperor. This was not just a change of title. It was a claim to Chinese legitimacy, an assertion that the Mongols were not merely conquerors, but the rightful rulers of China, inheritors of the mandate of heaven that had justified Chinese dynasties for thousands of years. Traditional Mongols were horrified. To them, Kubilai was abandoning his heritage, becoming Chinese. But Kubilai saw it differently. He was not abandoning Mongol identity, but adding Chinese legitimacy to it. He would be both Khan and emperor, both Mongol warrior and Chinese sovereign. It was a balancing act that would define the rest of his reign. To symbolize this new dynasty, Kubilai established a new capital. He had been ruling from Khanbaliq, built on the site of modern Beijing. He expanded and rebuilt this city according to Chinese principles, but with Mongol flourishes, creating a capital that reflected his dual identity. The city was enormous, its walls enclosing an area of roughly 20 square miles, large enough to hold hundreds of thousands of people. Wide boulevards were laid out in a grid pattern. Palaces were constructed in Chinese architectural style, but decorated with steppe motifs. The completion of the Song conquest took another 8 years. The Song court fled south, from Hangzhou to Guangzhou, desperately trying to maintain their dynasty. But Kubilai's armies followed relentlessly. In 1279, the last Song emperor, a child of 8 years old, committed suicide by drowning himself in the sea rather than be captured. With his death, the Song dynasty ended, and all of China came under Mongol rule for the first time in history. Kubilai now ruled the most populous empire in the world. China alone contained perhaps 70 to 80 million people, more than the entire population of Europe. Managing this required a sophisticated administration that went far beyond traditional Mongol governance. Kubilai implemented a system that tried to balance Mongol dominance with Chinese cooperation. The population was divided into 4 classes. At the top were Mongols, who received preferential treatment in law, taxation, and government appointments. Second were non-Chinese allies, including Central Asians, Persians, and others who had served the Mongol Empire. Third were northern Chinese, descendants of the Jin dynasty subjects who had lived under Mongol rule for decades. At the bottom were southern Chinese, the former Song subjects, who were viewed with suspicion and heavily taxed. This system created resentment, particularly among the educated southern Chinese, who had been the elite of Song society and now found themselves at the bottom of the social hierarchy. But it also provided stability, at least in the short term. The Mongols, who comprised less than 2% of China's population, could not rule by force alone. They needed collaboration from at least some Chinese, and the system provided incentives for that collaboration. Kubilai also invested heavily in infrastructure. He expanded the Grand Canal, linking northern and southern China more effectively. He improved roads throughout the empire. He established the Yam postal system in China, connecting the country with a network of relay stations that allowed messages and officials to travel quickly. These improvements facilitated trade, improved tax collection, and helped integrate China's diverse regions. But Kubilai's ambitions extended beyond China. He launched 2 major invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, hoping to add the island kingdom to his empire. Both expeditions ended in disaster. The first was turned back by Japanese resistance and a storm. The second, far larger, involved perhaps 140,000 troops transported in thousands of ships. It too was destroyed by a massive typhoon that the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine wind sent by the gods to protect their islands. These failures cost enormous resources and lives, but did not significantly weaken Kubilai's position. He also launched expeditions against Vietnam, Burma, and Java, with mixed results. Vietnam successfully resisted Mongol conquest despite multiple invasions. Burma became a tributary state. The Java expedition was a costly failure. These campaigns revealed the limits of Mongol power. Naval operations were not their strength. Jungle warfare negated their cavalry advantages, and distance made logistics increasingly difficult. The Mongol Empire had reached its natural boundaries, at least in the east. In China itself, Kubilai's reign brought both prosperity and problems. Trade flourished under Mongol rule. The Silk Road, now entirely under Mongol control from China to the Black Sea, was safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants travelled freely, protected by the yam system and Mongol laws that severely punished those who harmed traders. Chinese goods, particularly silk and porcelain, flowed west in unprecedented quantities. In return, China received silver, spices, and ideas from across Eurasia. Kubilai welcomed foreign visitors to his court. The most famous was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who claimed to have spent 17 years in Kubilai's service and whose book about his travels introduced Europe to the wonders of Yuan China. Whether all of Marco Polo's claims were accurate is debated by historians, but his account reflected a real phenomenon. Khanbalik had become a truly cosmopolitan city, where Persian merchants traded with Chinese scholars, where Christian priests debated with Buddhist monks, where the cuisine and customs of a dozen cultures mixed and mingled. Kubilai himself was curious about all religions. He was officially Buddhist, or at least patronized Buddhism generously, but he also received Taoist priests, Christian missionaries, Muslim scholars, and practitioners of traditional Mongol shamanism. He held religious debates at his court, listening to representatives of different faiths argue their positions. This tolerance was not entirely altruistic. By supporting multiple religions, Kubilai prevented any single faith from becoming a focus of resistance to Mongol rule. But problems were accumulating. The paper currency that Kubilai introduced, backed by government authority rather than precious metals, suffered from inflation as the government printed more money to fund its expensive military campaigns. Taxation was heavy, particularly on the southern Chinese, breeding resentment. The division of society into ethnic classes created tensions that would eventually explode. Kubilai's personal life also brought challenges. His favorite wife, Chabi, died in 1281, leaving him devastated. He had always eaten and drunk heavily, as was common among Mongol nobility, but after Chabi's death, his consumption increased. He grew enormously obese, suffered from gout, and became less active in governance. His chosen heir, Genghis, died in 1285, predeceasing his father and creating succession uncertainty. Kubilai eventually designated Genghin's son, Temür, as heir, but the old Khan's grief over losing his son and favorite wife seemed to drain his energy and focus. Still, Kubilai continued to rule until his death in 1294 at the age of 78. He had reigned for 34 years, longer than any other Mongol Khan. He had completed the conquest of China, established a dynasty that would last nearly a century, and transformed the Mongol Empire from a collection of conquering armies into a sophisticated multi-ethnic state. His legacy was complex. To Mongols, he was both hero and traitor, the man who achieved the greatest conquests, but who also abandoned steppe traditions for Chinese ways. To Chinese, he was both foreign oppressor and legitimate emperor, the man who ended the Song dynasty, but who also patronized Chinese culture and maintained the bureaucratic systems that defined Chinese civilization. To the world, Kubilai Khan became the symbol of Mongol power at its zenith, the emperor described in Marco Polo's tales, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. He was the last of the great Khans, the final ruler who could credibly claim authority over the entire Mongol world. After his death, the Yuan dynasty would continue for another 74 years, but it would be increasingly Chinese in character, increasingly distant from its Mongol roots. The other Khanates would go their own ways, some converting to Islam, some maintaining steppe traditions, all gradually diverging from each other. The age of unified Mongol Empire had truly ended. What remained were the successor states, each fascinating in its own right, each carrying forward some aspects of Genghis Khan's legacy while adapting to local circumstances and cultures. Rest now and contemplate the image of Kubilai Khan, sitting in his Chinese palace, dressed in imperial yellow silk, conducting court according to Chinese ritual, yet still a grandson of the steppe, still shaped by traditions born in felt tents under endless skies. This was the paradox of empire, the conqueror who becomes what he conquers, the barbarian who becomes civilized, the nomad who builds cities. Sleep, and let these contradictions settle in your thoughts. Chapter 8. The Four Khanates. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire existed more as an idea than a reality. 4 distinct Khanates now ruled the territories that Genghis Khan and his successors had conquered, each developing its own character, its own relationship with the peoples it governed, and its own vision of what it meant to be Mongol in a world forever changed by conquest. The story of these four Khanates is the story of adaptation, of how a steppe culture transformed itself to rule settled civilizations, and ultimately, how those civilizations transformed the conquerors in return. The Yuan dynasty in China, which we have already explored through Kublai Khan's reign, was the wealthiest and most populous of the four. After Kubilai's death in 1294, his grandson Temür Khan succeeded to the throne. Temür was competent, but lacked his grandfather's vision and energy. He maintained the Yuan state, but did not expand it. The expensive military expeditions to Japan, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia were abandoned. The dynasty turned inward, focusing on governing China rather than further conquest. Subsequent Yuan emperors grew increasingly Chinese in their habits and outlook. They performed the traditional rituals expected of Chinese emperors. They patronized Chinese arts and literature. They employed primarily Chinese bureaucrats, with Mongols occupying high positions but rarely involving themselves in day-to-day administration. The distinction between Mongol conquerors and Chinese subjects began to blur, at least at the elite level. But this Sinicization came at a cost. Traditional Mongols, particularly those still living on the steppe or serving in the military, felt betrayed. They saw their leaders adopting the customs of the conquered, abandoning the warrior culture that had built the empire. Resentment grew between the Mongol military aristocracy and the increasingly Chinese imperial court. The Chinese population, particularly in the south, never fully accepted Mongol rule. The ethnic hierarchy that placed Mongols and their Central Asian allies above Chinese bred constant resentment. Heavy taxation to fund the imperial court and military drained the economy. Natural disasters, famines, and floods were interpreted through traditional Chinese lens as signs that the mandate of heaven was withdrawing from the Yuan dynasty. By the mid-14th century, rebellions began erupting across China. Secret societies, particularly the Red Turbans, organized resistance. What started as local uprisings grew into a full-scale civil war. The Yuan court, weakened by internal rivalries and incompetent emperors, could not effectively respond. In 1368, rebel forces captured Khanbalik. The last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia, and the Ming dynasty was proclaimed, marking the end of Mongol rule in China. The Yuan dynasty had lasted 97 years, less than a century. It had brought China unprecedented integration with the wider world, facilitated trade and cultural exchange, and demonstrated that China could be ruled by non-Chinese dynasties. But it had also been exploitative, ethnically divisive, and ultimately unable to reconcile Mongol and Chinese identities into a lasting synthesis. Far to the west, the Golden Horde presented a very different story. Established by Batu Khan in the 1240s, the Golden Horde controlled the vast steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, including most of what is now Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of Eastern Europe. Its capital, Sarai, built on the lower Volga River, became one of the largest cities in the medieval world, a thriving commercial center where East met West. The Golden Horde ruled its Russian territories through indirect control. Russian princes were allowed to maintain their domains, but they had to travel to Sarai to receive patents of authority from the Khan. They paid heavy tribute, provided soldiers when demanded, and understood that resistance meant destruction. This system, which Russians called the Tatar yoke, lasted for more than 2 centuries. The Golden Horde's culture was distinctly different from the Yuan dynasty's Sinicization. While Kubilai became Chinese, the Golden Horde Khans remained fundamentally steppe rulers, maintaining the nomadic traditions of their ancestors even as they controlled settled territories. Their wealth came not from governing cities directly but from controlling trade routes and extracting tribute. Religion proved to be a transformative force in the Golden Horde. In the early 1300s, Khan Özbeg converted to Islam, making it the official religion of the Khanate. This was a gradual process, not a sudden transformation. Many Mongols in the Golden Horde resisted conversion, clinging to traditional shamanism or the various religions they had encountered during their conquests. But over time, Islam became dominant, particularly among the elite. This conversion had profound implications. It aligned the Golden Horde with the broader Islamic world, facilitating trade with Muslim merchants and political alliances with other Islamic states. It also created ideological distance from the other Mongol Khanates. The Ilkhanate in Persia would eventually also convert to Islam, but the Yuan dynasty in China remained primarily Buddhist and shamanistic, while the Chagatai Khanate was divided between Muslim and non-Muslim factions. The Golden Horde reached its peak under Özbeg Khan and his son Janibeg, who ruled from 1313 to 1357. During this period, the Khanate was wealthy, stable, and militarily powerful. Sarai boasted magnificent mosques, busy markets, and a cosmopolitan population. The Mongol elite had become Turkic in language and culture, a process called Turkification that paralleled the Sinicization happening in China. The Golden Horde became, in effect, a Turco-Mongol Islamic state, distinct from its steppe origins. But the mid-14th century brought catastrophe. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that devastated Europe and Asia, struck the Golden Horde with particular severity. The disease likely entered Europe through Golden Horde territories, carried by traders and armies. Sarai and other cities suffered massive population losses. The economic disruption was enormous. Trade collapsed. Tax revenues plummeted. The Khanate's power began to wane. Internal strife followed. From 1357 to 1380, the Golden Horde endured a period called the Great Troubles, with more than 25 different Khans claiming power, most ruling for only months before being overthrown or assassinated. The unity that had made the Golden Horde powerful disintegrated into feuding factions. A brief revival came under Toktamish in the 1380s, but this too proved temporary. By the 1500s, the Golden Horde had fragmented into several smaller Khanates. The Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, each claimed succession from the Golden Horde but lacked its power. Russia, which had been subject to Mongol overlordship for more than 2 centuries, gradually reasserted independence. Ivan III of Moscow formally ended tribute payments in 1480. The Mongol period in Russian history was ending, though its cultural and political impacts would endure. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan in Persia and the Middle East, had perhaps the most complex relationship with its subject population. Hulagu had destroyed Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, making him a figure of horror in Islamic history. But Hulagu himself was not Muslim. He was Buddhist, influenced by his wife Dokuz Khatun, a Nestorian Christian. The Ilkhanate's early policy was one of religious pluralism, with Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and shamanists all present in the court and government. This created a unique situation. The Ilkhanate ruled a predominantly Muslim population, but was led by non-Muslim Mongols. Persian culture, language, and administrative traditions continued under Mongol overlordship. Persian bureaucrats managed the government. Persian remained the language of administration and high culture. In many ways, the Ilkhanate preserved Persian civilization even while transforming it through Mongol influence. The Ilkhanate also faced external threats. To the west lay the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut and remained hostile. To the north was the Golden Horde, with which the Ilkhanate had increasingly tense relations, partly over religious differences and partly over territorial disputes in the Caucasus. These conflicts drained resources and prevented the Ilkhanate from expanding further. The transformation came under Ghazan Khan, who ruled from 1295 to 1304. Ghazan converted to Islam, taking the Muslim name Mahmud. This was not just a personal decision but a political revolution. By converting, Ghazan sought to reconcile the Mongol rulers with their Persian Muslim subjects, ending the religious alienation that had characterized earlier Ilkhan rule. Ghazan's conversion was pragmatic and intelligent. He did not force all Mongols to convert immediately, allowing gradual acceptance. He reformed the administration, ending many of the abusive practices that had oppressed the Persian population. He stabilized the currency, promoted trade, and patronized Islamic architecture and learning. Under Ghazan, the Ilkhanate became a Muslim state, but one that retained Mongol military traditions and administrative efficiency. His successor, Ölge II, continued these policies. The Ilkhanate experienced a cultural renaissance, with Persian miniature painting, poetry, and architecture flourishing under Mongol patronage. The Mongols had become patrons of the very civilization they had nearly destroyed 50 years earlier. But the Ilkhanate, like the other Khanates, could not escape internal instability. After Ölge II's death in 1316, succession disputes weakened central authority. By the 1330s, the Ilkhanate was fragmenting. Local governors became independent rulers. The last Ilkhan died in 1335, and no successor could claim universal recognition. The Khanate dissolved into competing regional dynasties, each claiming Mongol legitimacy but lacking real unity. The fourth Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, had perhaps the most turbulent history of all. Named after Chagatai, Genghis Khan's second son, this Khanate controlled the heartland of Central Asia, including modern-day Uzbekistan, parts of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and western China. It was geographically positioned between the other three Khanates, which made it strategically important but also vulnerable to interference from its more powerful neighbors. The Chagatai Khanate was divided culturally and religiously. The western portion, including the great Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, was increasingly Islamic and sedentary. The eastern portion, bordering Mongolia and China, remained more traditionally Mongol, nomadic and shamanistic. This division created constant tension within the Khanate. Various Khans attempted to impose unity, but the Chagatai Khanate remained the weakest and most unstable of the four. It lacked the wealth of the Yuan dynasty, the cohesion of the Golden Horde, and the administrative sophistication of the Ilkhanate. Internal civil wars were frequent. By the mid-1300s, the Khanate had effectively split into western and eastern halves that barely acknowledged each other. Paradoxically, this instability preserved something important. The Chagatai Khanate remained more purely Mongol in character than the other three. While the Yuan became Chinese, the Golden Horde became Turkic Islamic, and the Ilkhanate became Persian Islamic. The Chagatai Khans, particularly in the east, maintained steppe traditions with less modification. This would have lasting consequences. In the late 1400s, Timur, also known as Tamerlane, emerged from the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, Timur claimed to be restoring the Mongol Empire. His conquests created a new, brief flowering of Central Asian power, demonstrating that the Mongol legacy was not yet exhausted. By the end of the 14th century, all four Khanates had either fallen or were in advanced decline. The Yuan dynasty was replaced by the Ming. The Golden Horde was fragmenting. The Ilkhanate had dissolved into successor states. The Chagatai Khanate existed only nominally. The age of Mongol Empire was ending, but its impacts would endure for centuries. The Mongols had connected east and west in unprecedented ways. They had facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and technological transfer across Eurasia. They had demonstrated that vast empires could be governed through sophisticated administration rather than simple military occupation. They had shown that religious tolerance could be a source of strength rather than weakness. They had also devastated populations, destroyed cities, and ended civilizations. The death toll from Mongol conquests is impossible to calculate precisely, but certainly numbered in the millions. Regions like Persia and Central Asia would take centuries to recover from the demographic and economic catastrophes inflicted by Mongol warfare. The four Khanates represented different experiments in how steppe conquerors could adapt to ruling settled civilizations. Each found different answers. Each ultimately failed to create lasting stability. But each also contributed to the complex tapestry of medieval Eurasian history, demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of empire. Rest now with these images of a divided world. Four successors to a once unified empire, each taking a different path, each facing its own challenges, each gradually being absorbed by the civilizations it had conquered. This is the paradox of conquest, that the victors are eventually transformed by their victories. Sleep and contemplate how power shifts, how empires rise and fragment, how nothing, no matter how mighty, endures, unchanged, forever. Chapter 9. Daily Life in the Mongol Empire. To truly understand the Mongol Empire, we must step away from battles and politics, from khans and conquests, and look instead at how people actually lived. What was daily existence like under Mongol rule? How did ordinary people experience this vast empire that stretched across half the world? The answer, of course, depends on who and where you were. Life for a Mongol herder on the steppe was vastly different from life for a Chinese farmer in Hangzhou or a Persian merchant in Tabriz. But certain threads connected these diverse experiences, certain features that made Mongol rule distinctive and, in some ways, surprisingly modern. Let us begin on the steppe itself, with the traditional Mongol way of life that continued even as the empire transformed around it. The jur, the circular felt tent that Westerners often call a yurt, remained the quintessential Mongol dwelling. Its design had evolved over centuries to perfectly suit nomadic life. The frame consisted of wooden lattice walls that could be collapsed and transported on camels or carts. Poles extended from the walls to a circular ring at the center, creating a dome that allowed smoke from the central fire to escape while providing remarkable stability against the constant steppe winds. The covering was made of felt, sheep's wool that had been beaten and compressed until it formed a dense, waterproof material. In winter, multiple layers of felt provided insulation against temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero. In summer, some layers could be removed or rolled up to allow ventilation. The entrance always faced south, away from the prevailing northern winds, and elaborate customs governed how one entered and moved within a jur. Inside, the space was organized with precise purpose. The northern section, directly opposite the entrance, was the honored position where the head of the household sat and where important guests were received. To the west, traditionally the men's side, weapons, saddles, and tools were kept. To the east, the women's side, cooking utensils and domestic items were stored. The center held the fire, the literal and symbolic heart of the home, which was never allowed to go completely out. A Mongol family's wealth was measured in livestock. Horses were most prestigious, essential for warfare, herding, and transportation. But the economy depended on a mixed herd. Sheep provided wool for felt, meat for food, and dung for fuel. Goats gave milk and hair. Cattle and yaks offered meat, milk, and could pull carts. Camels transported goods across long distances. A successful family maintained careful balance among these animals, understanding that diversification provided security against disease or harsh winters that might devastate any single species. The daily rhythm was dictated by animal needs. Women rose before dawn to milk the mares, a task requiring both skill and courage, as horses are far more temperamental than cows. The milk was placed in leather bags where it fermented into airag, the slightly alcoholic drink that was a staple of Mongol diet. Fresh airag was sweet and effervescent. Older airag became increasingly sour and potent. Men checked the herds, ensuring no animals had wandered during the night, and that predators, wolves primarily, had not attacked. Children, even very young ones, had responsibilities. By age 5 or 6, they helped watch sheep and goats. By 10, they could ride independently and assist with moving camp. There was no concept of a protected childhood on the steppe. Survival required that everyone contribute. Food on the steppe was primarily animal-based. Meat, usually boiled rather than roasted, provided protein. Milk products in various forms, yogurt, cheese, dried curds, offered nutrition and variety. Vegetables were rare luxuries, obtained through trade. The Mongol diet, high in fat and protein, was perfectly suited to the physical demands of nomadic life and the harsh climate. But the steppe Mongols were only a small portion of the empire's population. The vast majority of people under Mongol rule lived in settled communities, cities, and villages, where life continued with a mixture of continuity and change under new masters. In China, under the Yuan dynasty, daily life for most people remained recognizably Chinese, despite Mongol rule. Farmers still cultivated rice in the south and wheat in the north, following agricultural patterns established over millennia. They paid taxes to Mongol authorities instead of Chinese emperors, but the actual collection was often handled by Chinese officials, making the change less dramatic than one might expect. However, the ethnic hierarchy of Yuan China affected everyone's life. Mongols received preferential legal treatment. If a Mongol killed a Chinese person, the punishment was typically a fine. If a Chinese person killed a Mongol, execution was likely. This double standard bred resentment, but also enforced a clear social order that the Mongol minority used to maintain control over the vast Chinese majority. Chinese merchants, particularly Muslims from Central Asia and Mongols themselves, benefited from the expanded trade networks. The Silk Road, now entirely under Mongol control, was safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants could travel from China to Persia with Mongol-issued passports, called paisas, that guaranteed protection and access to the Yam postal stations for rest and remounting. The Yam system itself was one of the most remarkable features of daily life in the Mongol Empire. Every 20 to 30 miles along major routes, stations maintained fresh horses, food, and shelter. A courier carrying an urgent imperial message could cover over 100 miles in a day by constantly changing horses. Even ordinary travelers with proper authorization could use these stations, making long-distance travel faster and safer than it would be again until the railroad age. Merchants, carrying these paisas, enjoyed special protection. Mongol law severely punished anyone who robbed or harmed merchants. This was not altruism but economics. The Mongols understood that trade generated tax revenue and that protecting merchants encouraged commerce. Caravan routes that had been dangerous for centuries became relatively safe. Goods flowed in unprecedented volume. Cities under Mongol rule took on a distinctive cosmopolitan character. In Tabriz, the capital of the Ilkhanate at various times, Persian Muslims lived alongside Christian Armenians and Georgians, Jewish merchants from across the Islamic world, Chinese craftsmen brought from the East, and Italian traders from Genoa and Venice. Multiple languages were spoken, multiple currencies circulated, religious buildings of different faiths stood blocks apart. This diversity was policy, not accident. The Mongols had learned that prosperity came from tolerance. They did not care what gods their subjects worshipped, as long as taxes were paid and rebellions avoided. This pragmatic tolerance created spaces where different cultures interacted and learned from each other in ways that would have been impossible in more religiously uniform societies. The role of women in Mongol society was surprisingly progressive by medieval standards. Mongol women had property rights. They could own and manage herds. They could divorce, though this was not common. Widows often managed their deceased husbands' estates until sons came of age, and some, like Temüjin and Ogul-Khaimysh, served as regents ruling the entire empire. This relative gender equality shocked foreigners. European and Islamic visitors commented with disapproval on how Mongol women appeared in public without veils, spoke freely to men outside their families, and participated in business and even occasionally warfare. But on the steppe, where survival required everyone's contribution, rigid gender segregation was a luxury the Mongols could not afford. In conquered territories, Mongol rule did not immediately change women's status in local societies. Chinese women under the Yuan remained subject to Chinese customs, including foot binding, which the Mongols found bizarre and disturbing but did not prohibit. Persian women in the Ilkhanate continued to observe Islamic customs of seclusion. But Mongol women within these societies maintained their own freedoms, creating a visible contrast that may have influenced local women's consciousness of alternative possibilities. Education in the Mongol Empire reflected its diversity. Traditional Mongol education was oral and practical. Children learned by observation and participation. They memorized genealogies, heard epic tales of Genghis Khan and other heroes, and absorbed the customs and laws of their people. Literacy was unnecessary for most Mongols and remained rare outside the administrative elite. However, the Mongols recognized the value of literacy and learning in governing their empire. Kubilai Khan established schools in China. The Ilkhans patronized madrasas in Persia. These institutions primarily served local populations, training the bureaucrats and scholars needed to administer Mongol territories. But they also created opportunities for cultural exchange. Chinese students might study Persian texts translated into Chinese. Persian scholars might examine Chinese mathematical techniques. The Mongols themselves adopted writing systems from conquered peoples. The Uighur script, borrowed from Turkic peoples of Central Asia, became the official Mongol script. Later, under the Yuan dynasty, Phags-Pa script, created by a Tibetan Buddhist monk at Kubilai's request, was promoted as a universal script capable of writing Mongolian, Chinese, and other languages. Though Phags-Pa never became truly widespread, it represented the empire's multilingual, multicultural character. Medicine in the Mongol Empire was similarly diverse. Traditional Mongol healing relied on shamanic practices and herbal remedies passed down through generations. But the Mongols eagerly adopted medical knowledge from conquered peoples. Chinese physicians served in Mongol courts. Persian medical texts were translated and studied. The empire became a conduit for medical knowledge flowing between east and west. Disease, however, remained a constant threat. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 1340s, likely originated in Central Asia and spread along the trade routes the Mongols had made safer and more travelled. The very networks that facilitated commerce also facilitated pandemic. Cities across the Mongol Empire suffered massive casualties. The demographic impact contributed to the empire's decline, as populations shrank and economic activity contracted. Entertainment and leisure in the Mongol Empire varied by class and location. For steppe Mongols, wrestling was the supreme sport, a test of strength and skill that remained popular throughout the empire's existence. Archery competitions tested the skill essential for both hunting and warfare. Horse racing, with children as young as 5 or 6 serving as jockeys, demonstrated the quality of horses and the bravery of riders. Mongol nobility enjoyed elaborate feasts where arag and wine flowed freely. Islamic sources frequently commented on Mongol drunkenness, viewing it as evidence of barbarity. But for the Mongols, communal drinking was a social ritual, a way of building solidarity and celebrating victories or important occasions. These feasts included music, storytelling, and sometimes religious or philosophical debates. In cities, entertainment options expanded. Chinese theatres continued to operate under the Yuan dynasty, performing traditional operas. Persian cities maintained their coffeehouses where men gathered to hear poetry, discuss news, and play games. Mongol rulers patronized these activities, understanding that keeping urban populations content and entertained reduced the likelihood of rebellion. The legal system under Mongol rule was based on the yasa, the code of laws supposedly established by Genghis Khan. The yasa covered everything from theft and murder to more obscure matters like the proper way to butcher animals or the prohibition against urinating in water, which the Mongols considered sacred. Punishments were severe, often death for what later societies might consider minor offences, but the code applied equally to everyone, at least in theory. In practice, of course, justice was not equal. Mongols received more lenient treatment than conquered peoples. The wealthy could afford bribes that the poor could not. But the existence of a written code, enforced by judges who travelled circuit through Mongol territories, represented a more systematic approach to justice than existed in many medieval societies. Religious life in the Mongol Empire was extraordinarily diverse. In a single city, you might find Buddhist monasteries, Christian churches, Muslim mosques, and temples dedicated to various local deities. The Mongols taxed religious institutions but otherwise left them alone, creating a marketplace of faiths where different traditions competed for converts and patronage. This tolerance had limits. Religious figures were expected to pray for the Khan and the empire. Those who refused or who preached rebellion faced punishment, but ordinary religious practice was unmolested. Muslims performed their 5 daily prayers. Christians celebrated their liturgical calendar. Buddhists meditated in their monasteries. The Mongols observed these practices with curiosity but little interference. Daily life for ordinary people under Mongol rule was neither the paradise of perfect tolerance that some later admirers imagined, nor the hell of constant oppression that victims described. It was complex, varied, and changed over time. Early in the conquests, when Mongol armies were actively campaigning, life was brutal, marked by siege, massacre, and enslavement. But once territories were pacified, a kind of normalcy returned, a daily existence where most people focused on the timeless concerns of feeding families, raising children, and navigating whatever political and social systems governed their lives. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence and conquest, created spaces where different cultures met and interacted on a scale unprecedented in human history. A Chinese doctor might treat a Persian merchant in a city governed by Mongol officials, using techniques learned from Indian texts translated by Syrian Christians. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, not a peace free of conflict, but a period where vast territories operated under a single, overarching authority, allowing exchange and mixing that would have been impossible in a more fragmented world. Rest now in the quiet rhythms of daily life, far from battles and imperial politics. Picture a family in their ger, the fire crackling, children sleeping, horses grazing nearby under the endless stars. Picture a market in Samarkand, merchants from a dozen nations trading goods and stories, their languages mixing in the warm evening air. Picture a monastery in China, monks continuing their meditations, untroubled by the political changes swirling around them. These were the textures of life in the Mongol Empire, the human realities that persisted beneath the grand narratives of conquest and collapse. Sleep, and let these images of ordinary life balance the extraordinary history we have traced together. Chapter 10. Legacy and Decline. By the middle of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire that had once seemed invincible was crumbling. The four khanates that had replaced the unified empire were themselves fragmenting. The Yuan dynasty faced rebellion in China. The Golden Horde was splitting into competing factions. The Ilkhanate had dissolved entirely. The Chagatai Khanate existed only as a collection of warring principalities. The age of Mongol dominance was ending, but its impact on world history was just beginning to be understood. The decline had multiple causes, some dramatic, others subtle and slow-moving. Disease played a devastating role. The Black Death, which erupted in the 1340s, travelled along the very trade routes the Mongols had secured and protected. The pandemic killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, but it struck Asia equally hard. Cities across the Mongol domains suffered catastrophic mortality. Sarai, Tabriz, and countless other urban centres saw their populations collapse. The economic networks that had sustained the empire shattered as merchants died, trade ceased, and fear replaced the confidence that had characterized the Pax Mongolica. The plague's impact went beyond immediate death tolls. It disrupted agriculture as farmers died in their fields. It destroyed tax revenues as populations shrank. It undermined confidence in Mongol governance, as rulers proved as helpless against the epidemic as anyone else. The invisible killer achieved what no army had managed, breaking the spell of Mongol invincibility. But disease was only one factor. The empire had always faced an internal contradiction. The Mongols were a tiny minority, ruling vast populations of conquered peoples. In China, they comprised perhaps 2% of the population. In Persia, even less. They had conquered through military superiority, but maintaining control required more than military might. It required legitimacy, effective administration, and the cooperation of local elites. Over time, the Mongol rulers faced an impossible choice. They could maintain their distinct identity, remaining steppe warriors with nomadic traditions, but this meant staying foreign to the populations they governed, forever outsiders ruling through force. Or they could assimilate, adopting the languages, customs, and cultures of their subjects, gaining legitimacy, but losing the very identity that had made them Mongols. Different khanates made different choices. The Yuan dynasty chose assimilation, becoming increasingly Chinese with each generation. But this alienated the Mongol military elite, who saw their traditions being abandoned. The tension between Sinicized court and traditionalist warriors weakened Yuan China from within. When Chinese rebellions erupted in the 1350s and 1360s, the Mongol response was fatally divided and ineffective. The Golden Horde chose Islam and Turkification, transforming from Mongol to Turco-Mongol to essentially Turkic. This worked for a time, aligning the Khanate with the broader Islamic world, but it too meant losing distinctive Mongol identity. By the 1500s, the successor states of the Golden Horde were Turkic Muslim Khanates, Mongol in name and lineage, but not in culture or practice. The Ilkhanate attempted a middle path, maintaining Mongol military dominance while patronizing Persian culture and eventually converting to Islam. But this synthesis proved unstable. When strong Khans like Ghazan ruled, it worked. When weak or disputed successions occurred, the system collapsed into competing factions. By the 1330s, the Ilkhanate had fragmented into regional dynasties, each claiming Mongol legitimacy, but none capable of reassembling the whole. Succession disputes plagued all the Khanates. Genghis Khan had established the principle of Kurultai election, but this created opportunities for conflict rather than ensuring smooth transitions. Every succession became a potential civil war. Brothers fought brothers. Uncles contested nephews. Distant relatives claimed legitimacy through tenuous bloodlines. These conflicts drained resources, divided loyalties, and prevented the coordinated governance necessary for maintaining empire. Economic problems compounded political instability. The Mongols had built their empire through conquest, extracting wealth from defeated enemies and establishing tribute systems. But eventually, there were no more wealthy kingdoms to conquer. The empire reached its natural limits, bounded by oceans, deserts, and regions too poor or difficult to profitably control. Without continuous expansion, the economic model that had sustained Mongol power stopped working. Inflation struck the Yuan dynasty particularly hard. Kublai Khan's introduction of paper currency, backed by government authority rather than precious metals, had initially worked. But his successors printed money excessively to fund expensive lifestyles and military expeditions. The currency lost value. Merchants demanded payment in silver or goods rather than paper. The monetary system collapsed, taking much of the economy with it. Heavy taxation alienated populations throughout the empire. The Mongols had never been gentle rulers, but early in their conquests, they at least offered stability and security in exchange for tribute. As the empire aged and administration became more corrupt, taxes increased while services decreased. Chinese peasants groaned under tax burdens that enriched Mongol officials without providing corresponding benefits. Persian farmers faced similar exploitation. Resentment grew, and with it, the willingness to support rebellion. Climate change, though not understood in those terms, also contributed to decline. The 13th century had been relatively warm, with good growing seasons that supported large populations and extensive herds. The 14th century brought cooling, shorter growing seasons, and more severe winters. Harvests failed more frequently. Herds died in harsh winters. Food security declined, creating stresses that made populations more volatile and governments more fragile. The rebellions that finally broke Mongol power in China began among secret societies and millenarian movements. The Red Turbans, who mixed Buddhist beliefs with social grievances, led uprisings across southern China in the 1350s. The Yuan court, weakened by succession disputes and court intrigues, could not mount effective responses. Regional commanders became effectively independent, some still nominally loyal to the Yuan, others openly rebellious. From this chaos emerged Zhu Yuanzhang, a former Buddhist monk turned rebel leader, who proved to be a brilliant military commander and administrator. He methodically conquered rival rebel factions, then turned his armies against the Yuan. In 1368, his forces captured Khanbalik. The Yuan emperor, Tohon Temür, fled north to Mongolia with the remnants of his court, attempting to maintain the dynasty in exile. The Ming dynasty, which Zhu Yuanzhang established, presented itself as the restoration of Chinese rule after a century of foreign domination. The Ming actively suppressed Mongol influences, removed Mongol officials, and promoted a return to pure Chinese traditions. The Yuan dynasty, for all its accomplishments, was remembered primarily as a time of foreign oppression, an aberration in the flow of Chinese history. But the Yuan had lasting impacts. It had integrated China more fully into world trade networks than ever before. It had demonstrated that China could be ruled by non-Chinese dynasties, a precedent that would be repeated by the Manchu Qing dynasty centuries later. It had patronized Chinese arts, particularly drama and painting, producing works that would be treasured by subsequent generations. The legacy was complex, neither entirely positive nor entirely negative, but undeniably significant. In the West, the fragmentation of Mongol power allowed conquered peoples to reassert independence. Russia, which had been under Mongol domination for more than 2 centuries, gradually broke free. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had been relatively minor under Mongol rule, emerged as the center of Russian resistance. Ivan III, ruling from 1462 to 1505, formally ended tribute payments to the remnants of the Golden Horde and began calling himself Tsar, claiming succession to Byzantine imperial authority. The Mongol period profoundly shaped Russian development. The experience of subjugation created a siege mentality, a sense that Russia was separate from and threatened by both East and West. The administrative systems the Mongols had imposed influenced how Russian princes governed their own territories. The military techniques learned from Mongol occupiers informed Russian warfare for centuries. Even the Russian language absorbed Mongol words, particularly terms related to money, administration, and military affairs. In the Islamic world, the Mongol invasions had destroyed the political unity that had characterized earlier Islamic civilization. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had provided at least symbolic leadership for Sunni Muslims since 750, was gone. Regional dynasties, many claiming Mongol descent or legitimacy, competed for power. This fragmentation arguably made the Islamic world more vulnerable to later threats, particularly the expanding Ottoman Empire. But the Mongols also revitalized certain aspects of Islamic civilization. The Ilkhanate, particularly after its conversion to Islam, became a major patron of Persian culture. The Persian miniature painting tradition flourished under Mongol patronage. Persian poetry and literature experienced a renaissance. The Mongol period, for all its initial destruction, ultimately contributed to a flowering of Persian culture that influenced the entire Islamic world. The biological legacy of the Mongol Empire is measurable through modern genetics. Recent studies suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today carry Y chromosome markers descended from Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. This extraordinary genetic legacy reflects both the number of wives and concubines that Mongol nobility maintained and the empire's geographic extent. From China to Central Asia to Russia, Genghis Khan's descendants spread across the continent. The technological and cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had lasting impacts. Gunpowder technology, invented in China, spread westward through Mongol territories, reaching Europe by the 14th century and revolutionizing warfare. Printing techniques moved along the same routes. Agricultural innovations traveled in both directions. The Mongols themselves were not inventors or innovators, but they created conditions where innovations could spread faster and farther than ever before. The cartographic revolution in Europe owed much to knowledge gained during the Mongol period. European travelers like Marco Polo, William of Rubruck, and Giovanni d'Appian del Carpine brought back detailed accounts of Central Asia, China, and the Mongol court. These accounts, though sometimes fanciful, provided Europeans with their first relatively accurate understanding of Asian geography and cultures. Maps improved dramatically as this information was incorporated. The very concept of world empire, of a single political entity spanning multiple continents and encompassing diverse peoples, was demonstrated as feasible by the Mongols. Later empire builders, from Timur to the Ottomans to the various European colonial powers, drew lessons from the Mongol experience. The possibility of transcontinental empire had been proven, even if its sustainability remained questionable. The last great attempt to revive Mongol glory came from an unexpected source. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, emerged from the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate in the late 1400s. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but claimed legitimacy through marriage to a Genghisid princess. Between 1370 and 1405, Timur conquered an empire nearly as vast as the original Mongol Empire, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Timur consciously modelled himself on Genghis Khan, though his methods were even more brutal. His conquests killed millions and destroyed cities across Central Asia, Persia, and India. But his empire, like the Mongol Empire before it, could not outlast its founder. Timur died in 1405 while preparing to invade China. His empire quickly fragmented among his descendants, demonstrating again that personal conquest, no matter how extensive, could not create lasting, institutional stability. Yet Timur's legacy included one enduring achievement. His descendants established the Mughal Empire in India, which would last from the early 1500s until the mid-1800s. The Mughals, though ruling India, maintained their Mongol identity and drew legitimacy from their connection to Genghis Khan through both Timur and other lineages. The Taj Mahal, perhaps the most famous building in India, was built by a Mughal emperor who traced his ancestry back to the Mongol conquerors. By the 1600s, the Mongol political presence had faded. The last Mongol Khanates in Central Asia were conquered by Russian expansion. The Crimean Khanate, last vestige of the Golden Horde, fell to Russia in 1783. Mongolia itself became a backwater, caught between Russian and Chinese expansion, eventually divided between them. The people who had once conquered the world became subjects of empires built by others, but the memory persisted, and persists still. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is revered as the father of the nation, his face appearing on currency, his image adorning public buildings. The shame that characterized Mongolian identity during the Soviet period, when Genghis Khan was portrayed as a feudal oppressor, has been replaced by pride in the achievements of the medieval empire. In the countries that were conquered, memories are more complex. Russians remember the Tatar yoke as a period of suffering and oppression, though historians increasingly recognize the Mongol period's influences on Russian development. Chinese historians, after decades of portraying the Yuan dynasty negatively, now acknowledge its contributions to China's development and its place in Chinese history, though it remains controversial. In the Islamic world, the destruction of Baghdad remains a wound, yet the cultural achievements of the Ilkhanate period are also recognized. The Mongol Empire's ultimate lesson may be about the limits of conquest. Military power can seize territories, but cannot alone create lasting unity. Cultural differences, geographic distances, economic systems, and human aspirations for autonomy all work against the centripetal forces that empires try to impose. The Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in history, and it lasted barely more than a century in unified form. Yet, for that brief time, they connected the world as it had never been connected before. They proved that different cultures could coexist under a single system, even if not always peacefully or equally. They demonstrated that religious tolerance, even when motivated by pragmatism rather than principle, could be a source of strength. They showed that administrative innovation and military prowess together could achieve what neither could alone. The grass grows tall on the steppes where this story began. The winds still blow across the same endless horizons. The descendants of those who rode with Genghis Khan tend their herds much as their ancestors did 8 centuries ago. But the world they live in was shaped, for better and worse, by what their ancestors accomplished. The Mongol Empire is gone, but its echoes continue to reverberate through the modern world, subtle but persistent, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are temporary, but their influences endure long after their power has faded. Conclusion. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, standing once more on the windswept steppe where everything began. 8 centuries separate us from the moment when Temüjin became Genghis Khan, when scattered tribes became a unified force, when horsemen from the grasslands rode out to reshape the world. Those centuries have softened the sharp edges of history, blurred the details of countless lives lived and lost, and transformed brutal reality into legend and memory. What can we say, finally, about the Mongol Empire? It was vast beyond comprehension. At its height, it controlled approximately 24 million square kilometers, nearly a quarter of Earth's land surface. No empire before or since has matched this geographic extent. A traveler could journey from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, crossing mountains and deserts, passing through dozens of climates and cultures, and never leave Mongol territory. It was swift in creation. Genghis Khan launched his first major campaign beyond the steppe in 1205. By 1279, when Kubilai Khan completed the conquest of southern China, the Mongols had conquered more territory in 74 years than Rome had acquired in 4 centuries. This speed of expansion was unprecedented and has never been matched. It was brutal beyond measure. The cities destroyed, Urgench, Merv, Baghdad, Ryazan, and countless others. The populations massacred, numbered conservatively in the millions, perhaps as high as 40 million over the course of all Mongol conquests. The cultural treasures lost, libraries burned, irrigation systems destroyed, civilizations ended. The suffering inflicted by Mongol warfare represents one of history's great catastrophes. Yet it was also, paradoxically, a force for connection and exchange. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection as never before or since. Ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions moved between East and West with unprecedented freedom. Chinese papermaking reached Europe. Persian astronomy influenced Chinese science. European travelers brought back knowledge of distant lands. The Pax Mongolica, bought with blood and maintained through fear, nevertheless created conditions for exchange that enriched all the cultures it touched. It demonstrated remarkable religious tolerance, at least by medieval standards. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, shamanists, and others coexisted within Mongol territories, often in the same cities. This was not modern pluralism based on principle, but pragmatic acceptance based on the understanding that religious diversity did not threaten Mongol power. Yet the effect was similar. Ideas competed peacefully that elsewhere were settled by sword and fire. It revealed both the possibilities and limitations of conquest. The Mongols proved that military superiority and organizational genius could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. They showed that vast empires could be governed, that diverse peoples could be coordinated, that the known world could be unified under a single authority. But they also demonstrated that such empires were inherently unstable, that cultural differences eventually reasserted themselves, that conquest could not create lasting loyalty, only temporary submission. The question of legacy remains complex and contested. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is a national hero, the founder who united the people and built an empire that made Mongolia central to world history. His face appears on money, buildings, and monuments. Children learn his story as an inspiration. The shame and silence of the Soviet period, when Mongol history was suppressed, has given way to open celebration. In the conquered lands, memories are darker. Russians still speak of the Tatar yoke, the centuries of subjugation that shaped their history and psychology. The Islamic world remembers the destruction of Baghdad as one of history's great catastrophes, the end of the golden age of Islamic civilization. Chinese historians debate whether the Yuan dynasty should be celebrated as a period of territorial expansion and cultural exchange, or condemned as foreign occupation. These different memories reflect genuine historical complexity. The same empire that facilitated trade and protected merchants also massacred populations and destroyed cities. The same rulers who practiced religious tolerance also imposed ethnic hierarchies and heavy taxation. The same system that promoted merit over birth also enslaved millions. History rarely offers simple moral judgments, and the Mongol Empire resists easy categorization. Perhaps what we should take from this history is humility. The Mongols, emerging from a harsh land with limited resources, conquered sophisticated civilizations that considered themselves the pinnacle of human achievement. Chinese, Persian, Russian, and Arab societies, each with centuries or millennia of accumulated culture and learning, fell to warriors they had dismissed as barbarians. This should remind us that civilizational confidence is no defense against determined adversaries, that military power can trump cultural sophistication, that the future is not always controlled by those who seem most advanced. But we should also note that the conquerors were ultimately absorbed by the conquered. The Mongols who ruled China became Chinese. Those who ruled Persia became Persian. Those who ruled Russia became Turkic and Muslim. The cultures they conquered proved more durable than the military prowess that had overthrown them. Conquest is temporary. Culture endures. This, too, is a lesson worth remembering. The Mongol Empire also reminds us that individual lives matter in history. Without Temüjin, there would have been no Genghis Khan, no unified Mongol tribes, no world-spanning empire. His personal qualities, his strategic brilliance, his ruthless pragmatism, his ability to inspire loyalty and terror in equal measure, these shaped the course of world history. Yet he was not inevitable. He survived multiple moments where he could easily have died. He succeeded in uniting tribes that had been enemies for generations, a feat that required not just military skill but political genius. Similarly, the deaths of individual Khans Ögedei, Mongke, redirected the empire's trajectory. Had Ögedei lived another decade, Europe might have fallen to Mongol conquest. Had Mongke survived his Chinese campaign, the succession crisis that fragmented the empire might have been avoided. Individual lives and deaths, combined with chance and circumstance, shaped outcomes that affected millions. The technological and cultural exchanges facilitated by the Mongol Empire had impacts that extended far beyond the empire's political existence. Gunpowder weapons, spreading from China through Mongol territories to Europe, revolutionized warfare and helped end the feudal age. The cartographic knowledge Europeans gained from contact with the Mongol Empire contributed to the age of exploration that would follow. The very idea that the world could be unified, that distant lands could be reached and governed, planted seeds that would flower in later European colonial empires. Even the genetic legacy persists. Those 16 million men carrying Y chromosome markers from Genghis Khan and his close relatives represent a biological echo of empire, a reminder that historical events leave traces not just in archives and monuments, but in our very cells. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you can hold this entire vast story in your mind like a jewel, turning it to catch light from different angles. The boy with nothing who became the conqueror of everything. The warriors from nowhere who humbled ancient civilizations. The empire that connected the world and then dissolved like morning mist on the steppe. the legacy that persists in languages, cultures, genes, and memories 8 centuries after the empire itself crumbled into dust. The steppe where this story began remains. The grass still grows, the wind still blows, the sky stretches infinite and blue, the same Tengri that watched over Genghis Khan and his warriors. The empire they built is gone, but the steppe endures, indifferent to human ambitions and human accomplishments alike, a reminder that we pass through history while the earth remains. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. It is a story of conquest and destruction, of brilliance and brutality, of connection and catastrophe. It is a story that shaped our world in ways both obvious and subtle. It is a story worth knowing, worth understanding, worth carrying forward in memory. Thank you for taking this journey through time and across continents. Thank you for listening to a tale of horsemen and emperors, of cities and steppes, of rise and fall and enduring legacy. May you sleep well, dream deeply, and wake tomorrow with wonder at the vast complexity of human history and our small but meaningful place within it. Rest now. The story is told. The history is remembered. And somewhere on the wind that blows across the Mongolian steppe, perhaps there echoes still the sound of hoofbeats, fading now, receding into legend, but never entirely gone. Good night.